You don't belong here, and I'm going to make sure you understand that before this day is over." The words hang in the October air like smoke from a slow fire, thick, deliberate, carrying the weight of someone who believes their authority is absolute. The rookie cop stands 6 inches from the quiet man's face, one hand already reaching for the cuffs on his belt, the other gripping a shoulder that hasn't flinched, hasn't tensed, hasn't moved at all. The quiet man just watches, not with fear, not with anger. With something the rookie has never encountered on a traffic stop or a wellness check or any of the 14 calls he's handled in his 11 months on the force. Patience. The kind of patience that comes from knowing exactly how this ends when the other person doesn't. The rookie shoves him against the patrol car. The quiet man's glasses slip sideways on his face. He doesn't fix them. What the rookie doesn't know, what nobody standing on East 48th Street in Savannah, Georgia knows at 3:32 on this Thursday afternoon, is that the man he's about to handcuff has spent the last 21 days documenting every civil rights violation in this precinct. And every second of what happens next is already being recorded. The dispatch log will read like a confession. 911 call ID 74291, received 15:27 hours, October 9th. Caller, female, identified as Margot S. Quote, "There is a man, black, standing in front of the Hemmings property on East 48th. He has been there at least 5 minutes writing something down. I think he is casing the house. The Hemmings are in Europe. Nobody should be there." End quote. No weapon observed. No crime in progress. Dispatch classification. Suspicious person. 5 minutes. A man standing on a public sidewalk for 5 minutes. And that was enough to activate the machinery of suspicion. Enough to send a patrol car screaming down a tree-lined street. Enough to put a rookie's hand on his cuffs before he'd asked a single question. The handcuffs click shut. Cold steel against warm skin. The quiet man exhales once. Slow, measured. The breath of someone who has trained himself to stay calm in rooms designed to break people apart. And somewhere across town, at a federal field office that this rookie has never set foot in, a secure system registers a missed check-in. Then another. Then a third. An alert flashes red on a screen that only 4 people in the state of Georgia have clearance to access. The machinery begins to move. Because the quietest man on East 48th Street is not who anyone thinks he is. And by tomorrow morning, every officer who touched him today will understand exactly what it costs to arrest the wrong person for the crime of existing. If this story already has you hooked, hit that subscribe button, because what happens next is something this rookie will regret for the rest of his career. 3 weeks before the handcuffs, before the dispatch call, before any of it, Nolan Beckett moved to Savannah with 1 suitcase, a laptop bag, and a lease on a studio apartment above a frame shop on Habersham Street. The landlord, a retired florist named Dottie, who smelled permanently of lavender and furniture polish, asked what brought him to town. "Real estate consulting," he said, and handed her a business card. Cream-colored stock, simple font. Beckett Consulting. Below it, a phone number that rang to a voicemail box he checked twice a day, but never from the same device. Dottie studied the card, then studied him. 36 years old, slim build, wire-frame glasses that made him look professorial. Polo shirt 1 wash past its prime. Khakis with a crease that might have been ironed or might have been folded in a suitcase for 12 hours. Shoes, brown Oxfords, resoled at least once, polished but not shiny. "Well," Dottie said, tucking the card into her apron pocket, "welcome to Savannah. Garbage goes out Tuesday nights." He smiled, thanked her, carried his suitcase up the narrow stairs without asking for help. That first morning, Nolan woke at 5:15, not to an alarm. His eyes simply opened at the same time they'd opened every morning for the past 14 years, a rhythm set so deep it had outlasted time zones, jet lag, and the kind of sleepless nights that left other men reaching for pills or bottles. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, feet finding the floor in the exact spot they always found it, and began the routine that had become as automatic as breathing. Sheets pulled tight. Hospital corners. Blanket folded into a rectangle precise enough to pass inspection in any barracks on any base in the country, though Nolan had never served in the military and would have said so if anyone asked. Shoes placed parallel at the foot of the bed, toes pointing toward the door. Notebook, a moleskin, black, grid-ruled, opened to a fresh page on the desk, pen clipped to the spine. Ready. He ran 3 miles before sunrise. No headphones, no music. Just the sound of his breathing and the slap of his shoes on Forsyth Park's jogging path, and the careful, almost mechanical way his eyes tracked the landscape. The bench count on the east side. The sight lines from the fountain. The angles where streetlights created blind spots after dark. He wasn't running for exercise. He was mapping. By the 3rd day, he knew which patrol cars passed Habersham Street and at what intervals. By the 5th, he could predict shift changes at Central Precinct within 6 minutes. By the end of the first week, he had filled 11 pages of the moleskin with notes that looked, to anyone who might glance at them, like property assessments, square footage estimates, zoning codes, neighborhood comps. They were not property assessments. The coffee shop on Bull Street, sentient bean, green awning, creaky screen door, became his morning anchor. He arrived at 6:45, ordered black coffee, sat at the corner table by the window, and read the Savannah Morning News cover to cover. He nodded at regulars, smiled at the barista, never started a conversation, but never refused one either. "You always sit in the same spot," the barista observed on day 4. Young woman, nose ring, Savannah College of Art and Design sweatshirt. "Creature of habit," Nolan said. What he didn't say was that the corner table gave him a direct line of sight to the intersection of Bull and Liberty, where a patrol car from the 3rd Precinct passed every morning between 6:52 and 7:03, or that the window's reflection let him monitor the door behind him without turning around, or that the newspaper he read so carefully was his alibi for the 37 minutes he spent each morning observing police traffic patterns from a civilian vantage point. He didn't say those things because saying them would have ended the most important assignment of his career before it properly began. The microaggressions started on day 3. Savannah First Federal Credit Union, Drayton Street branch. Nolan walked in wearing a blue button-down, asked to open a premium checking account, and presented 2 forms of identification, Georgia driver's license and a secondary ID he carried for exactly these situations. The teller, white woman, mid-50s, reading glasses on a beaded chain, looked at his license, looked at him, looked at the license again. "Premium checking requires a minimum deposit of $5,000, she said, the words shaped like a question even though they weren't one. "I'm aware." "And you're sure that's the account type you want?" "Yes." "Because we have basic checking that might be more." "Premium, please." She processed the deposit with the careful slowness of someone who expected the check to bounce. It didn't. She printed his temporary card without comment, but her eyes followed him to the door, and Nolan caught the glance she exchanged with her colleague at the next window. Eyebrows raised, lips pressed, the universal shorthand for, "Can you believe that?" He noted the interaction in his moleskin that evening. Date, time, teller window number. Not because a banking slight was a federal matter, but because patterns lived in details, and details lived in habits, and habits, when they belonged to an entire institution rather than a single person, told you everything you needed to know about the culture you were investigating. Day 8 brought the patrol car. Nolan walked the 12 blocks from his studio to East 48th Street, to Ardsley Park, where the house he was purchasing sat behind a wrought iron fence and a live oak whose canopy threw shade across the entire front yard. The closing was scheduled for the following week. The real estate agent had given him the lockbox code, but Nolan didn't use it. He stood on the public sidewalk, notebook in hand, sketching the roofline, estimating the cost of replacing the gutters on the south face. A Savannah PD patrol car rolled past, slowly. Nolan noted the unit number without looking up. 7 Baker 3, 3rd Precinct, Chatham County jurisdiction. The car reached the end of the block, turned, came back. Slower this time. The officer in the passenger seat, young, white, military-style haircut, watched Nolan through the window for 4 full seconds before the car continued. Nolan wrote down the time. 3:17 p.m. He wrote down the unit number. He wrote down the duration of visual contact. 4 seconds, long enough to memorize a face, short enough to deny surveillance. The car did not return a third time, but the fact that it came twice was enough. Day 14 introduced Margot Sinclair. She materialized on the sidewalk like a weather system, sudden, unavoidable, and carrying the atmospheric pressure of someone who believed property values were a form of personal identity. 63 years old, white, blonde hair the precise shade that comes from a bi-weekly salon appointment, tennis bracelet, linen blazer even though it was 78 degrees, president of the Ardsley Park Neighborhood Association, a title she wore the way generals wear stars. "Excuse me." Not a greeting, a checkpoint. Nolan looked up from his notebook. "I've seen you here before," Margot said. "Several times, actually. And I don't think you're from this neighborhood." "No, ma'am, I'm not." "Then may I ask what your business is on this street?" Nolan closed the notebook, held it at his side, gave her the same patient, slightly distant smile he'd given the bank teller, the barista, the landlord, the smile of a man who understood that explanations were a form of submission, and that he owed this woman nothing, but that refusing to perform civility came with costs. A black man in the American South calculated automatically. "I'm looking at property," he said. "Property." She repeated the word as if tasting something unexpected. "In Ardsley Park." "Yes, ma'am." "Do you have an appointment with someone? A realtor? Because the Hemmings, they're in Europe until November, and—" "I'm not here for the Hemmings." He handed her a business card. Same cream stock, same simple font. Beckett Consulting. Margot held the card between 2 fingers, studied it, then looked at him. The full inventory, top to bottom. Glasses, polo, khakis, brown Oxfords. Everything about him said ordinary, unremarkable, belonging to a tax bracket that bought houses in neighborhoods with fewer live oaks and less wrought iron. "Well," she said, "we have very strict guidelines about solicitation in this neighborhood. HOA rules." "I'm not soliciting anything, ma'am. I'm standing on a public sidewalk." She left. But the way she left, brisk, deliberate, phone already in her hand, thumb scrolling for a number, told Nolan everything he needed to know about what would happen next. Not today. Maybe not tomorrow. But soon, Margot Sinclair would call someone, and that someone would wear a badge. He made a note of it. Date, time, physical description, verbatim quotes as close as memory allowed. Then he walked home, ate dinner, and spent 3 hours reviewing data on a laptop whose encryption protocols would have made the NSA pause. 12 blocks away, at the 3rd Precinct's briefing room, a 24-year-old probationary officer named Trey Garland sat in a plastic chair and read his field training officer's weekly evaluation for the 3rd time. The words hadn't changed. They weren't going to change. But reading them again felt like pressing on a bruise, painful and compulsive and impossible to stop. Officer Garland shows adequate technical knowledge but lacks decisiveness in confrontational situations. During the October 2nd domestic disturbance call on Waters Avenue, Garland hesitated to issue commands and deferred to responding backup rather than establishing scene control. Command presence needs significant improvement before end of probationary period. Recommend additional scenario training. Signed, Sergeant Vernon Pratt, FTO. Command presence. The phrase sat in Garland's chest like a stone. He'd joined Savannah PD because his father had been Chatham County Sheriff's Office for 22 years, because the badge meant something in his family, because he'd grown up believing that law enforcement was the highest form of public service. He'd graduated 3rd in his academy class, scored top marks in defensive tactics, could recite Georgia criminal code sections from memory. But Pratt's evaluation didn't mention any of that. It mentioned hesitation. It mentioned deference. It mentioned the moment on Waters Avenue when Garland had seen a woman crying and a man pacing and had chosen to ask questions before issuing orders. And Pratt, arriving 30 seconds later, had pushed past him, grabbed the man's arm, twisted it behind his back, and had the situation controlled in under a minute. "That's how you handle it," Pratt had said afterward, not unkindly. "You can't let them see you think." Garland had nodded, swallowed the objection that rose in his throat, that the woman hadn't been in danger, that the man had been pacing because his mother had just died, that controlling the situation had meant slamming a grieving son into a wall. He swallowed it because probationary officers who argued with their FTOs didn't make it past month 12, and month 12 was 5 weeks away. 5 weeks. 35 days to prove that Trey Garland had what it took. He folded the evaluation, put it in his breast pocket, checked his belt, radio, cuffs, taser, sidearm, flashlight. Everything in its place. Everything ready. Tomorrow, he promised himself. Tomorrow, he would not hesitate. October 9th broke clear and warm, the kind of Savannah autumn day where the humidity drops just enough to make the air feel like a gift instead of a punishment. Spanish moss hung from the live oaks on East 48th Street like gray curtains, filtering the afternoon light into something soft and almost golden. At 3:22 p.m., Nolan Beckett stood on the sidewalk in front of 417 East 48th Street and opened his notebook to a fresh page. The house, his house, as of next Tuesday's closing, needed work. The roof's south-facing slope had 3 rows of missing shingles. The wrought iron fence leaned at the northeast corner where a root had shifted the post. The front porch, wide, covered, the kind of porch where generations of families had sat with sweet tea and watched the world move slowly past, had a soft spot near the second step that his home inspector had flagged. He sketched the roof line, noted the gutter damage, estimated linear feet of fencing that would need reset. Ordinary work. The work of a man buying a house and making plans for it. At 3:27 p.m., the 911 call dropped. He didn't hear it. Didn't know about it until much later, when the recording was entered into evidence and read aloud in a room where the people who'd acted on it were forced to sit and listen to what it actually said. 911. What is your emergency? The woman's voice, clipped, certain, carrying the cadence of someone accustomed to being taken seriously, would later be identified as Margot Sinclair, though she gave only her first initial and last name to the dispatcher. There is a man outside the Hemmings residence on East 48th Street in Ardsley Park. Black male, mid-30s. He's been standing there writing things down. The Hemmings are out of the country. Nobody should be at that property. I believe he's casing the house. The dispatcher's response was professional, measured. Ma'am, has the individual attempted to enter the property? Has he damaged anything or made threats? He doesn't need to enter. He's surveilling it, writing in a notebook. He's been here before. I've seen him multiple times. Is he on the property or on the sidewalk? A pause. The kind of pause that happens when a question forces someone to confront the gap between what they feel and what they can prove. He's near the property, the sidewalk, but his intent is clear. Ma'am, we'll send a unit to check it out. Can you stay on the line? I'll be watching from my house, 403 East 48th. Hurry, please, before he gets away. Gets away, as if standing still on a public sidewalk were a form of escape. As if the very act of existing in a space required a permission slip that Margot Sinclair had apparently designated herself to issue. The call lasted 1 minute and 43 seconds. It contained no description of criminal activity, no evidence of trespass, no weapon, no threat. Just a woman's certainty that a black man with a notebook did not belong in her neighborhood. A certainty so complete that it didn't require evidence, didn't require logic, didn't require anything except the phone number for emergency services and the knowledge, learned over 6 decades of American life, that when she called, someone would come. Unit 7 Baker 3 received the dispatch at 3:30 p.m. Officer Trey Garland, behind the wheel for the first time that shift. Pratt had let him drive, a small gesture of trust that felt enormous, pulled a U-turn on Victory Drive and headed for Ardsley Park. Pratt was 2 blocks behind in his own vehicle, monitoring on the radio. Standard FTO protocol. Let the rookie handle it. Observe from a distance. Intervene only if necessary. Garland's heart rate climbed. He could feel it in his throat, in his fingertips on the steering wheel, in the way his vision sharpened until the world outside the windshield looked hyper-real, every detail knife-edge clear. Suspicious person call. Possible casing. Residential area. This was it. This was the kind of call where command presence meant something, where decisiveness separated real cops from clipboard jockeys. He keyed his radio. 7 Baker 3 responding. ETA 2 minutes. He did not run the caller's history, did not check whether 403 East 48th had made previous calls, did not query the property records for 417 East 48th to see if a sale was pending. These were steps that experienced officers sometimes took and that academy instructors recommended, and that 24-year-old probationary officers, trying to prove their decisiveness, often skipped. Garland pulled onto East 48th Street at 3:31 p.m. He saw the subject immediately. Black male, mid-30s, medium build, standing on the sidewalk in front of a house with a wrought iron fence, glasses, polo shirt, notebook in hand. No visible weapon, no sign of attempted entry, no indication whatsoever of criminal activity except the fact that Margot Sinclair had decided his presence required police intervention. Garland parked 3 houses down, got out, adjusted his belt, the unconscious gesture of a young officer settling into authority, walked toward the man with the notebook. Nolan saw him coming, had seen the patrol car turn onto the street, had noted the unit number, 7 Baker 3, same unit that had driven past twice on day 8, and had known, with the calm certainty of a man who'd spent 3 weeks waiting for exactly this, that the next 10 minutes would determine whether his investigation lived or died. He closed his notebook, held it at his side, kept his hands visible. "Sir." Garland's voice came out harder than he intended. Command presence, he told himself, even though what it actually sounded like was nervousness wearing a mask. "Step away from the property, hands where I can see them." "Good afternoon, officer." Nolan's voice, quiet, even, carrying the same patient cadence that had characterized every interaction he'd had in Savannah. "I'm standing on a public sidewalk. Is there a problem?" "We received a call. Suspicious activity. What are you doing here?" "Looking at the house." "Why?" "Because it interests me." The answer was polite, accurate, legally sufficient, and infuriating to a 24-year-old who had been told that hesitation was weakness, and who could feel, in the back of his mind, the weight of Pratt's evaluation pressing like a thumb on a bruise. "I'm going to need to see some identification," Garland said. "Can you tell me what specific criminal activity you suspect me of? I'd like to know the basis for the stop." Garland's hand moved to his belt. Not his weapon, his radio. The instinctive reach for backup that officers make when a situation isn't following the script they expected. Cooperative subjects produce ID without being asked twice. Uncooperative subjects argue, resist, escalate. This man was doing something Garland's training hadn't prepared him for. He was being calm. "Sir, I'm asking you to produce identification. If you've got nothing to hide, this'll take 2 minutes." "I don't have anything to hide, officer, but I also have the right to know the basis for a stop before I'm required to identify myself. Can you tell me your name and badge number? I'd like that for my records." The word sat differently in the air than it should have. Records, not complaints, not lawyers. Records. Spoken with the precise diction of someone who used the word professionally, who understood that documentation was a form of power, who was already building something with every second that passed. Garland didn't catch it, didn't hear the weight behind the word or the training beneath the calm. He heard a man refusing a lawful order, at least what he believed was a lawful order, and felt the window of decisive action closing. "Garland," he said, "badge 4712. Now, your ID, last time I'm asking." Nolan reached slowly into his back pocket, pulled out a wallet, extracted a Georgia driver's license and extended it between 2 fingers. Garland took it, read it. Beckett, Nolan J. address on Habersham Street, not Ardsley Park, not this neighborhood. "This address isn't in this neighborhood," Garland said. "You don't live here." "I didn't say I lived here. I said I was looking at the house. That's not a crime, officer." "It is if you're trespassing." "I'm on a public sidewalk." Garland keyed his radio. 7 Baker 3. "I've got a male subject at 417 East 48th. Need a NCIC check on Georgia license." He read the number, or tried to. The digits blurred under the afternoon light, and he transposed 2 of them, reading the 7 as a 1. "That's incorrect." Nolan's voice, still calm, still quiet, but cutting through the radio chatter with the precision of a scalpel. "The number is G04773298165. 12 digits, recited from memory without glancing at the card in Garland's hand. Perfectly sequenced. No hesitation." Garland stopped, looked at Nolan, looked at the license, back at Nolan. "Who memorizes their driver's license number to 12 digits? The question surfaced and submerged in the same breath because Garland's radio crackled. Dispatch confirming NCIC query, no wants, no warrants, license valid, no criminal history. And the answer should have ended it. Clean record, no warrants. Man standing on a sidewalk with a notebook. Case closed. Have a nice day. But Garland heard Pratt's voice in his head. Command presence. Decisiveness. The evaluation folded in his breast pocket like a verdict waiting to be revised. "Turn around," Garland said. "Hands behind your back." "On what charge?" "Suspicious activity. Possible trespassing." "Officer Garland, I am on a public sidewalk. Georgia Code Section 17-5-21 requires articulable suspicion of a specific crime. You've run my ID. It came back clean. Standing on a public sidewalk does not constitute trespassing under Section 16-7-21, which requires that a person be on private property and have been told to leave or that signage is posted. Neither condition applies." The words came out smooth, precise, delivered without heat, the way someone recites something they know the way they know their own name. Not from a phone, not from a card, from memory, from training, from years of studying exactly this kind of encounter from the other side of a badge. Garland heard the statutes, heard the logic, heard the calm, devastating accuracy of a man who knew the law better than the officer trying to enforce it, and decided, in the 3-second eternity between hearing the truth and acting on it, that compliance mattered more than correctness. That a man who quotes law at a cop is a man who needs to be controlled. That the evaluation in his pocket was a louder voice than the one standing in front of him. He grabbed Nolan's wrist, spun him. The notebook fell to the sidewalk, pages fluttering open, grids covered in small, precise handwriting that Garland didn't look at because he was focused on getting the cuffs on proving that this time he would not hesitate. The handcuffs clicked shut. Nolan exhaled. Once. Slow. The breath of a man who has trained himself to remain still when every instinct says fight. His glasses had slipped again, knocked sideways by the force of the spin. He didn't fix them. "You're making a mistake, officer." Garland's voice dropped into what he believed was authority, but what actually sounded like the thin edge of fear wrapped in bravado. "We'll see about that." Across the street, on the porch of 421 East 48th, a woman named Felicia Greer, 43, hairdresser, homeowner for 11 years, set down the glass of iced tea she'd been drinking and picked up her phone. She opened the camera app, hit record. "He didn't do anything," she called out, loud enough for every person on the block to hear, loud enough for the phone's microphone to capture clearly. "I watched him. He was standing there with a notebook. That's it." Garland didn't respond. He was leading Nolan toward the patrol car, one hand on the cuffs, the other on Nolan's elbow. The textbook transport grip that the academy taught and that felt, in this moment, less like procedure and more like performance. A couple walking their dog stopped on the opposite sidewalk. An elderly man stepped onto his porch 2 houses down. A teenager on a bicycle slowed, pulled out his phone, began recording. Nolan walked without resistance, back straight, head level, steps measured, the posture of a man who understood that every second of this encounter was evidence, that his body was a witness, that the way he moved would matter in rooms he hadn't entered yet. "You hear me?" Felicia called again. "He's been coming around here for weeks. He's buying a house on this street. This is his property you just arrested him in front of." Garland opened the patrol car's rear door, guided Nolan in, hand on the top of his head, pushing down, the gesture that every arrested person knows and that every cop learns in week 2 of the academy. Nolan folded himself into the back seat. The vinyl was cracked, the interior stale with the smell of fast food and industrial cleaner. No seatbelt offered. The door closed. Through the window, Nolan could see Felicia on her porch, phone still raised, the couple with the dog, the teenager on the bicycle. Margot Sinclair, standing at the end of her driveway at 4:03, arms crossed, chin lifted, the posture of vindication. He noted all of it, every face, every position, every phone that was recording, building the map of witnesses the way he'd built every map in his career, methodically, patiently, from the ground up. Then the car began to move. Sergeant Vernon Pratt pulled up to the scene 2 minutes after Garland's patrol car left. He'd been monitoring on the radio, heard the dispatch, heard Garland's NCIC request, heard the clean return, heard nothing after that, which meant either everything was fine or everything was about to become a problem. He found the second option. Felicia Greer was on the sidewalk, phone in hand, talking to the couple with the dog. The teenager had ridden away but was almost certainly posting video. Margot Sinclair had retreated to her porch, watching with the satisfied stillness of someone who'd set a machine in motion and was content to let it run. Pratt parked, got out, and assessed. 18 years on the force. 3 commendations, 2 complaints, both dismissed. He'd been an FTO for 6 years and had trained 19 rookies, every one of whom had either made it through probation or been counseled out before they could become a liability. Garland was supposed to be number 20, but number 20 had just arrested a man on a public sidewalk for the crime of standing still, and the witnesses were already on their phones, and Pratt could feel the situation degrading the way experienced soldiers feel weather changing, not through data, but through instinct. He keyed his radio. 7 Baker 5 to 7 Baker 3. Garland, what's your 20? Transporting to Central. ETA 5 minutes. Copy. I'm en route. Do not begin processing until I arrive. He got back in his car and drove. Not fast, not with lights, thinking about how to package this. Because Vernon Pratt was not a man who fixed mistakes by acknowledging them. He was a man who fixed mistakes by rewriting them, adjusting the narrative until the shape of the story matched the shape of procedure, until anyone reading the report would see a justified stop, a lawful arrest, a textbook encounter that happened to involve a subject who was, unfortunately, uncooperative. It was a skill, not one they taught at the academy, but one that 18 years on the force had refined into something almost artistic. He arrived at Central Precinct 4 minutes after Garland. Found his rookie standing in the processing area, one hand on Nolan's elbow, the other holding the notebook that had fallen on the sidewalk. The notebook was open. Pratt could see the handwriting. Small, precise, grid paper orderly. It didn't look like property assessments. "Walk me through it," Pratt said, pulling Garland aside but not out of Nolan's hearing. Not because he wanted Nolan to hear, because he'd forgotten, in the rush of damage control, that the subject was standing 6 feet away, with ears that missed nothing. Suspicious person call, 911. Subject was at 417 East 48th, observing the property, taking notes. ID came back to a different address. Didn't match the neighborhood. Subject was... Garland paused, searching for the right word. Uncooperative. Uncooperative how? Refused to explain his presence. Cited statutes. Argued about reasonable suspicion. Pratt's eyes narrowed. Not at the facts. At the word. Cited statutes. Civilians didn't cite statutes. They argued, complained, threatened to call their lawyers. They didn't stand on sidewalks quoting Georgia code section numbers from memory. He looked at Nolan. The quiet man stood by the processing desk, hands cuffed behind his back, glasses still slightly crooked, watching Pratt with the same patient attention he'd given Garland. The attention of someone who was not merely present in a situation but studying it. "What do you do for a living, Mr.?" Pratt glanced at the license in Garland's hand. "Beckett?" "Real estate consulting." "And what were you doing at that address?" "Evaluating the property, which I'm entitled to do from a public sidewalk without police interference." Pratt heard the precision, heard the calm, heard the control that didn't waver even with cuffs on, and that small observation, which should have been a warning, instead became a justification. Because in Vernon Pratt's experience, people who stayed this calm during arrests were people who'd been arrested before. Experienced criminals, professionals, men who knew the system because they'd been through it enough times to learn its rhythms, not men who knew the system because they were the system. "We'll sort this out," Pratt said. The phrase, friendly, reasonable, the voice of institutional patience, was the same phrase he'd used 100 times before, and it meant exactly what it always meant. "We will decide what happened, and you will accept our version." He pulled Garland around the corner, spoke low. "What else do you have, beyond the 911 call and the address mismatch?" That's it." Pratt stared at him. The evaluation he'd written, decisiveness, command presence, suddenly felt less like a critique and more like a prophecy. He'd told the rookie to be more decisive, and the rookie had been decisive in exactly the wrong way, at exactly the wrong time, with exactly the wrong person. But Pratt didn't say that. Didn't say, "You arrested a man for standing on a sidewalk, and now we have witnesses and video, and a subject who quotes statute numbers, and we're going to need more than a 911 call from a nervous HOA president to make this hold." Instead, he said, "Let me handle the narrative." 4 words. The sound of 18 years of institutional knowledge compressing a situation into manageable shape. He stepped back to the processing area. "Mr. Beckett, we're going to need to sort out a few details. For everyone's safety, we'll conduct a brief interview here at the precinct. Shouldn't take long." "Am I under arrest or being detained for questioning?" "We're investigating a report of suspicious activity in a residential area. Your cooperation would be appreciated." "That's not an answer, Sergeant. If I'm free to leave, I'd like to do so. If I'm under arrest, I need to know the charges, and I'm requesting my phone call and access to an attorney." Pratt's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly, but Nolan saw it. The way the muscles along the jawline flexed, the way the sergeant's weight shifted half an inch backward, the unconscious recalibration of a man who'd expected compliance and received precision instead. This story is just getting started. If you want to see what happens when the truth comes out, hit that like button and keep watching. A voice from the far side of the processing area broke the standoff. "Hey, Pratt. You hear about that BOLO update?" Officer Kip Delaney walked in holding a cup of vending machine coffee and wearing the expression of a man who'd been waiting for an opportunity and had just found one. 31 years old, 7 years on the force, passed over for detective twice. Applied for the gang unit once and been told, not officially, never officially, that his interpersonal skills needed work, which was departmental code for a complaint file that contained 3 excessive force allegations, all cleared by internal affairs, all leaving traces in the institutional memory that kept him stuck in patrol while younger, less experienced officers moved up. Delaney resented the system, but he understood it well enough to use it. BOLO. Pratt turned. October 3rd residential burglary series. We still have an active lookout. IC3 male, mid-30s, medium build. I ran it on my way in. Delaney glanced at Nolan, then back at Pratt. The glance was casual. The timing was not. Might be worth checking. Pratt looked at Delaney, looked at Nolan. The calculation happened in real time, visible, if you knew what to watch for, in the slight relaxation of his shoulders, the almost imperceptible nod, the way his breathing slowed as the pieces of a justification clicked into place. A BOLO match. Be on lookout. It wasn't probable cause by itself, but it was enough to hang a narrative on. Enough to justify the arrest retroactively. Enough to transform a sidewalk stop with no legal basis into an investigative detention with a documented reason. IC3 male, mid-30s, medium build. Pratt repeated it slowly, the words settling into the report he was already writing in his head. That's a potential match. Nolan heard the word BOLO from 6 feet away. Heard Delaney's delivery, the rehearsed casualness, the convenient timing, the specificity of a description that could match a quarter of the black male population of Chatham County. He'd seen this maneuver before, had documented it in 4 other jurisdictions, the retroactive justification, the after-the-fact reason manufactured to support a decision that had already been made. His breathing slowed, a controlled rhythm. In through the nose, 4 counts. Hold, 4 counts. Out through the mouth, 4 counts. The technique they taught at Quantico for maintaining operational calm in hostile environments. "Officer," Nolan said, addressing Delaney directly for the first time, "if there's an active BOLO, I have the right to know the specific description and the case number it's associated with. That's basic disclosure." Delaney's smile was thin. "This isn't a courtroom, buddy. You don't get discovery rights on the street." "No, but it will be reviewed. And when it is, every transmission on Channel 3 will be logged and cross-referenced, including the one you just referenced." The smile faded. Not all at once, but enough. A flicker of something behind Delaney's eyes that might have been caution, or might have been the first tremor of a man who'd just realized his bluff had been called by someone who knew exactly how radio logs worked. Pratt stepped between them. "Mr. Beckett, we're going to place you in a holding area while we verify this information. You'll have access to a phone once processing is complete." "Processing for what? You still haven't told me the charges." "Investigative hold, pending identification, and BOLO clearance." "Georgia law doesn't recognize investigative hold as a detention category, Sergeant. I'm either arrested with specified charges or I'm free to leave. There's no middle ground." Pratt didn't respond. He nodded to Garland, who took Nolan's elbow, firmly, not roughly, but with the grip of a man who'd been told to be decisive and had chosen this, of all moments, to follow that instruction, and guided him toward the holding area. Nolan went. Not because he had to. He knew his rights, knew the law, knew that every second of this detention was building the kind of case that federal prosecutors dreamed about. He went because resistance, at this stage, would give them a charge. Obstruction. Resisting. The magic words that officers use to convert illegal detention into justified arrest, to transform the victim of a rights violation into the perpetrator of a criminal act. He went because the most powerful thing he could do right now was exactly what he'd been doing for the past 21 days. Nothing. Observe. Document. Wait. The holding area smelled like bleach and old sweat. Metal bench bolted to a concrete wall, steel toilet in the corner without a partition, fluorescent light that buzzed at a frequency designed, it seemed, to make the passage of time feel both endless and meaningless. Garland removed the handcuffs, stood in the doorway. "Your belongings will be inventoried and stored. I want to see the property inventory form, and I want to sign it. We'll get to that. I'd also like my phone call. After processing." "When does processing begin?" No answer. Garland closed the door. The lock engaged with a sound that Nolan had heard before, in training exercises, in scenario simulations, in the controlled environments where federal agents learned what it felt like to be on the wrong side of a cell door so they could better understand the people they spent their careers either protecting or prosecuting. But this wasn't training. This was real. He sat on the metal bench, placed his hands on his knees, straightened his back, closed his eyes, and began to organize. Time. 15:52. Approximate, based on the clock he'd seen in the processing area. Arresting officer, Garland, badge 4712. Supervising officer, Pratt, badge number observed on uniform, 2908. Third officer, Delaney, badge number partially observed, 51. The rest obscured by his vest. He'd need to confirm later. Route from scene to precinct. Liberty Street south to Montgomery, west to Oglethorpe, south to Habersham, east to the precinct parking lot entrance. Total time, 7 minutes. He'd counted 4 traffic cameras on the route, one at Liberty and Drayton, one at Montgomery and Bull, one at Oglethorpe and Whitaker, one at the precinct entrance. 4 potential sources of footage that would confirm transport time and route. Physical contact during arrest. Garland grabbed right wrist, applied spin, forced arms behind back. Not excessive, but unnecessary given full compliance. The notebook dropped during the maneuver. Pages fell open. Garland did not pick it up. Pratt arrived. Did Pratt retrieve the notebook? Unclear. Note: determine chain of custody for notebook. Phone confiscated. No property inventory form presented. No signature requested. Violation of department policy. And the phone itself was not a personal device. It was a government-issued, encrypted, secure communications platform whose seizure by local law enforcement without a warrant constituted potential violation of 18 U.S.C. Section 641, theft of government property. But that was a card to play later. Much later. The fluorescent light buzzed. The holding cell's ventilation system pushed recycled air that tasted like metal and institutional neglect. Nolan sat still. Patient. The way he'd sat in surveillance vehicles for 12-hour shifts. The way he'd sat in briefing rooms waiting for operational green lights. The way he'd sat in 100 uncomfortable places doing the one thing his career had taught him was more powerful than any weapon or warrant or badge. Waiting. 2 floors above the holding cell, in the administrative wing of Central Precinct, Sergeant Pratt sat at a desk that wasn't his and wrote a report that required more creativity than accuracy. The incident report, Form SPD-17, arrest/detention narrative, had boxes for time, location, subject description, arresting officer, charges, and a narrative field that could hold up to 2,000 characters of explanation. 2,000 characters to transform a sidewalk stop without probable cause into a justified investigative detention. 2,000 characters to protect a rookie's career, a department's reputation, and Pratt's own record as an FTO who trained officers that made good arrests. He typed carefully. Officers responded to a 911 call reporting a suspicious male at 417 East, 48th Street, Ardsley Park. Upon arrival, subject was observed surveilling the vacant property and taking detailed notes. Subject's ID showed an address outside the neighborhood. When asked to explain his presence, subject was evasive and confrontational, citing legal statutes in an attempt to avoid identification. Subject's description matched active BOLO number BL-24-0317 for October 3rd residential burglary series. IC-3 male, mid-30s, medium build. Based on the totality of circumstances, 911 call, subject's behavior, BOLO match, and lack of verifiable connection to the property, subject was detained for investigative purposes pending positive identification and BOLO clearance. Pratt read it twice, changed confrontational to non-compliant, softer, harder to challenge. Added for officer safety after detained, the magic phrase that justified almost anything in police reports. He saved the file, printed 1 copy for the shift log, sent the digital version to Lieutenant Sheridan for authorization. Then he walked down to the holding area, stood outside the door, looked through the observation window at Nolan Beckett, who sat motionless on the metal bench with his eyes closed. Not sleeping, Pratt noted, because his breathing was too regular, too controlled, too deliberate for sleep. Something else. Something that looked like meditation, or mental exercise, or the kind of disciplined stillness that Pratt had only ever seen in one other context. Military. That's what it looked like. The seated posture of someone who'd been trained to endure confinement, to manage stress through physiological control, to treat every environment, even a holding cell, as an operational space. But the NCIC check had come back clean. No military record flagged. No prior arrests. No wants, no warrants. Just a Georgia driver's license, a business card for a consulting firm, and a man who quoted statutes from memory and recited his license number to 12 digits without looking. Pratt watched for another 30 seconds, then went back upstairs. The notebook was on his desk. Garland had brought it in, chain of custody already compromised, since neither officer had logged it on a property inventory form. Pratt opened it. Grids, small handwriting, dates, times, locations, what looked like property sketches, roof lines, fence measurements, square footage calculations. Normal enough, consultant's notes. But interspersed with the property data were other notations. Abbreviations that didn't match any real estate terminology Pratt recognized. Numbers that could have been addresses or could have been badge numbers. Timestamps that corresponded not to property viewings but to patrol patterns. Pratt turned to page 17, a list, 2 columns, left column, dates, right column, codes he couldn't decipher. The dates spanned the past 3 weeks, exactly the period Beckett claimed to have been in Savannah. He stared at the page. The back of his neck prickled. The instinct of an 18-year veteran who'd learned to recognize when a situation was bigger than it appeared, when the ground beneath a routine stop was softer than it looked. He closed the notebook, did not log it, did not photograph it, put it in his desk drawer and locked the drawer. Whatever Nolan Beckett was doing in Savannah, it wasn't real estate consulting. And if Pratt was wrong about that, the notebook would be returned and no harm done. But if he was right, if this man was something other than what he appeared, then the less documentation existed about the contents of that notebook, the better. For everyone. At 7:12 p.m., Lieutenant Blythe Sheridan opened Pratt's report on her desktop, scanned it for 30 seconds, and signed the authorization for extended hold. 22 years on the force. 12 as a lieutenant. A career built on efficiency, on the ability to move paper, manage personnel, and keep the precinct running without the kind of disruptions that drew attention from downtown. Sheridan did not micromanage her officers. She did not second-guess field decisions. She believed, had always believed, that the men and women under her command knew their jobs, that the system worked, that when a sergeant with 18 years of experience wrote a report justifying an arrest, the appropriate response was trust, not interrogation. The report said BOLO, match, said non-compliant subject, said totality of circumstances. She signed it. Extended hold. Up to 24 hours pending investigation. She did not watch the body cam footage. Did not review the 911 call. Did not speak to the subject. Did not ask why a man with no criminal record, no warrants, and a valid Georgia driver's license was being held without charges in her precinct on a Thursday evening. 1 signature, 12 seconds of reading, 22 years of institutional trust. And a man sat in a holding cell below her feet, counting the minutes, organizing the evidence, preparing for the moment, still hours away, when everything she'd failed to check would become everything she'd be forced to answer for. At 8:17 p.m., Nolan opened his eyes. The fluorescent light hadn't changed. The ventilation still pushed metal-tasting air. The bench was no more comfortable than it had been 3 hours ago. But something had shifted, not in the cell, not in the precinct, but in the calculus of the situation. 3 hours without a phone call. 3 hours without charges. 3 hours without a property inventory for his confiscated belongings, without access to an attorney, without a single officer returning to explain what investigative hold meant or how long it would last. This was not incompetence. This was strategy. Nolan had seen it before. The strategy of delay. Hold someone long enough without charges, and one of two things happens. Either they break, start talking, start pleading, start offering information in exchange for release, or they become so disoriented by the lack of process that when process finally arrives, they're too exhausted to challenge it. Neither was going to happen here. But the officers didn't know that. They were operating under the assumption that Nolan Beckett was a civilian, a real estate consultant with an inconvenient knowledge of legal statutes, but no actual power to enforce them. A man who could quote Georgia code all day, but who was still sitting in a cell, still cuffed to the system's timeline, still waiting for someone else to decide what happened next. The assumption was wrong, but correcting it now would destroy 21 days of work. So Nolan did what he'd been doing since the handcuffs closed. He documented, quietly, under his breath, a murmur that anyone passing the cell door might mistake for prayer or muttering or the early signs of stress. But that was, in fact, a precise oral record of every relevant detail. October 9th. Detained at approximately 15:32 hours. Transported to Central Precinct. Arrival, 16:14. No Miranda advisement prior to transport. No charges read at scene or upon arrival. Phone confiscated at 16:22. No property inventory form. No signature. Notebook confiscated. Time unknown. Chain of custody uncertain. Phone call denied at 16:31, 16:47, and 17:05. 3 requests, 3 denials. Officers involved: Garland, badge 4712, Pratt, badge 2908, Delaney, badge number 5133, confirmed from uniform observation during processing area encounter. 4th officer, Sheridan lieutenant, name observed on administrative door, badge number not yet confirmed. He paused, listened. The precinct had its own rhythms, shift changes marked by clusters of footsteps and radio chatter, quiet periods where the building seemed to breathe, sudden bursts of activity when calls came in. He'd been tracking these rhythms for 3 hours, building a baseline the way he'd built baselines at the coffee shop, on the jogging path, on the street in front of the house he was supposed to be buying. At 9:41 p.m., the cell door opened. Pratt stood in the doorway, holding a clipboard. Behind him, Garland, looking younger in the harsh corridor light, looking like what he was, a kid who'd made a decision he couldn't unmake and was beginning to understand that the consequences hadn't finished arriving. "Mr. Beckett," Pratt said, "we have a few questions." "Am I being charged?" "We're still investigating." 5 hours without charges. That exceeds the standard for an investigative detention under Terry v. Ohio and its progeny. I'm requesting immediate release or formal arraignment. And I'm repeating my request for a phone call and access to an attorney. Pratt's expression didn't change. The words rolled off him the way water rolls off institutional stone, acknowledged, absorbed, ignored. He'd heard subjects quote case law before. Most of them got it wrong. This one hadn't gotten anything wrong yet, which was its own kind of problem. "Your phone call will happen after we complete the interview," Pratt said. "The sooner you cooperate, the sooner this is resolved." "Sergeant, I've been fully cooperative. I provided identification. I answered your questions. I did not resist arrest. I'm now requesting the rights I'm legally entitled to, rights that have been denied for 5 hours. This is documented." "Documented by who?" Nolan looked at Pratt. The look, steady, unhurried, weighted with something the sergeant couldn't name, held for 3 seconds before Nolan answered. "By me." The interview room was identical to 1,000 other interview rooms in 1,000 other precincts across the country. Metal table bolted to the floor. 3 chairs. Overhead light that was either too bright or not bright enough. Mirror on the far wall. One-way glass that was supposed to conceal observers, but that everyone who'd ever watched a police procedural knew about. Nolan sat in the chair facing the mirror. Hands on the table. Still cuffed, which was unusual for an interview and which Pratt had not explained. Pratt sat across from him, clipboard on the table, pen in hand. Garland stood by the door, trying to look authoritative and managing, at best, present. "Tell us about your relationship with 417 East 48th Street, Pratt began. "I'm purchasing the property. Closing is scheduled for next Tuesday." "You have documentation of that?" "My real estate attorney has the contract. Her name is Sandra Polk, Polk and Associates, on Broughton Street. Call her." "We'll verify that." "In the meantime, can you explain why you've been observed at that address on multiple occasions over the past 2 weeks?" "I was evaluating the property I'm buying. Checking the roof, the fence, the structural condition, standard due diligence. With a notebook. That's typically how people take notes, Sergeant. Pratt's pen stopped. He looked at Nolan. Really looked, the way he should have looked hours ago, when the man was standing on the sidewalk quoting statute numbers. What he saw was not what he expected to see. Not the defiance of a criminal. Not the anxiety of an innocent man wrongly accused. Something else. Something Pratt's 18 years hadn't equipped him to identify. Patience. Complete. Bone-deep. Almost terrifying patience. The patience of a man who was not waiting for this to end, but waiting for it to get worse. Because worse was better for whatever he was actually doing here. The realization came to Pratt the way weather comes to sailors, not all at once, but in shifting pressure, in the direction of the wind, in the almost imperceptible changes that experienced people feel before they can name. Something was wrong with this arrest. Not legally wrong, he already knew that. Deeper wrong. The kind of wrong that turned routine incidents into career-ending events, that transformed minor mistakes into major investigations, that pulled threads whose other ends were attached to things you didn't want to see unravel. "I need to step out for a moment," Pratt said, standing. He left the interview room, walked down the corridor, pulled out his phone, called Delaney. "The BOLO you referenced, BL-24-03-17. Pull it up for me. I want to see the full description and current status." A pause, the kind of pause that contains its own answer. "It should be in the system," Delaney said. "Pull it up." "I'm at home. I can check tomorrow." "Pull it up now." Another pause, longer this time. Then, "I'll call you back." Pratt waited in the corridor. 3 minutes. 5. 7. The phone didn't ring. He called again. Voicemail. The pressure in his chest tightened. The sailor watching the barometer drop. He walked back to the interview room. Sat down. Looked at Nolan Beckett, who hadn't moved. Same posture, same patience, same glasses, sitting slightly crooked on a face that revealed nothing. "Mr. Beckett, I'm going to level with you. There may have been some miscommunication about the BOLO reference. We're going to need to keep you here while we sort that out." "How long?" "Overnight, most likely. The lieutenant has authorized a hold." "On what legal basis?" "Investigation of suspicious activity in connection with a reported property crime." Nolan nodded. Slowly. Not in agreement. In acknowledgement. The nod of a man who has just watched someone dig a hole deeper and has decided, for reasons of his own, to let them keep digging. "I want my phone call, Sergeant. That's not a request." "First thing in the morning. Georgia Code Section 17-4-20 requires phone access within a reasonable time following arrest. 5 hours is not reasonable by any court standard." Pratt stood up. "First thing in the morning, Mr. Beckett." He nodded to Garland, who opened the door. "Officer, escort Mr. Beckett back to holding." Garland reached for Nolan's elbow. This time the touch was lighter, hesitant. The rookie's face had changed over the past 5 hours. The confidence was gone, replaced by something that looked like the earliest stages of doubt. The moment when the adrenaline of decisive action fades and the questions it was covering begin to surface. Did I do the right thing? Was there actually a crime? Why does this man know more law than I do? Questions Garland didn't ask out loud. Questions that would keep him awake tonight on his apartment's second-hand couch, staring at the evaluation in his pocket, wondering if command presence was supposed to feel like this. At 10:08 p.m., a detective named Amara Lee walked through the booking area on her way to the vending machines. Amara was internal affairs, a position that made her simultaneously necessary and despised within the department. 41 years old, 15 years on the force, the last 4 in IA. She hadn't chosen the assignment. It had been offered as an alternative to a complaint she'd filed about evidence handling in the narcotics unit. A complaint that had been sustained, but that had marked her, in the department's unspoken hierarchy, as someone who couldn't be trusted with the comfortable silence that kept institutions running. So they'd put her in IA, where her instinct for detecting irregularities could be aimed at individual officers rather than systemic problems. It was a promotion on paper and a quarantine in practice. She checked the booking log. Routine, a habit she'd developed to catch the kind of small errors that, left unchecked, became large lawsuits. Names, charges, times, processing officers. One entry stopped her. Beckett, Nolan J. Booked 1622. Charge, investigative hold, pending. Processing officer, Garland T. Badge 4712. Authorizing, Lieutenant Sheridan. No charge code. Investigative hold, pending, wasn't a valid booking classification. It was a placeholder, the kind of thing officers used when they hadn't figured out what to charge someone with but didn't want to release them. Amara had seen it before. Usually with DUI stops where the breathalyzer was broken, or with domestic calls where neither party wanted to press charges, but the officers wanted documentation. Inconvenient, sloppy, technically a policy violation, but usually harmless. What made this one different was the duration, 6 hours. 6 hours of pending without a charge code was not sloppy. It was a problem. She walked to the holding area, looked through the observation window. The man inside sat on the metal bench with his back straight, hands on his knees, eyes open, watching the door, watching her through the small window, though he couldn't see her face clearly through the reinforced glass. She opened the door. "Mr. Beckett." Her voice carried a different weight than the others. Professional but present, the voice of someone who understood that the person on the other side of a holding cell door was still a person. "I'm Detective Lee, Internal Affairs. I noticed some irregularities in your booking paperwork. Are you all right? Do you need water?" Mr. Beckett. "Not sir. Not buddy." Not the clipped impersonal address that officers use to maintain distance from the people they detained. Mr. Beckett, the smallest form of respect, and in the context of Central Precinct's holding area at 10 o'clock on a Thursday night, the most significant. Nolan looked at her. The assessment was automatic. Rank insignia, badge position, the IA designation on her credential holder, the way she stood in the doorway without entering, giving him space, treating the cell as his territory rather than hers. He nodded. "Water would be appreciated, Detective." She brought him a paper cup from the corridor fountain. He drank it in 3 swallows. "How long have you been here, Mr. Beckett?" 6 hours, approximately." "Have you been charged?" "No." "Have you had your phone call?" "No." "Have you been presented with a property inventory for your belongings?" "No." Amara's expression didn't change. But something shifted behind her eyes. A hardening, a setting, the look of a woman who had spent 4 years in internal affairs, learning that the ugliest things happened not in dark alleys, but in brightly lit precincts where people who wore the same badge as she did made decisions that violated the rights of people who couldn't fight back. "I'll look into this," she said. "Thank you, Detective." She left. The door closed. The lock engaged. But the interaction, 30 seconds, 5 questions, 1 cup of water, changed something in the precinct's atmosphere. Not visibly, not dramatically, but in the way that pressure changes in a room when someone opens a window. A shift in airflow, a new current, the first hint that the sealed environment was no longer sealed. Amara Lee went back to her desk and opened the detention log on her computer. And across town, 23 minutes earlier, at 9:45 p.m., a secure laptop in the FBI's Savannah field office displayed a notification that its owner would not see until she returned from dinner at 10:17 p.m. Automated alert. Operation Clean Sweep. Agent Beckett, N.J., SSA. Status: check-in missed. Second consecutive. Last confirmed location: Central Precinct, Savannah PD. GPS. Government phone. Protocol: Level 2. ASAC notification required. ASAC. Denise Okafor set her car keys on the desk, read the alert, and went still. Nolan Beckett had never missed a check-in, not once in 21 days, not once in the 3 years she'd supervised him, not once in the 7 years she'd known him, through the academy, through 2 field offices, through the kind of cases that burned out agents who lacked his specific, almost unsettling capacity for patience. She called his phone. "The number you have reached is not available." Called again. Same message. Called the backup number. A second device, separate network, activated only in emergencies. Disconnected. The word sat in her chest like ice. Disconnected meant the device had been powered down or seized. It did not disconnect on its own. It could not be turned off remotely. Someone had physically taken the phone and shut it off or removed the battery, and the GPS placed that phone's last known location inside a police precinct. Okafor sat down, pressed her palms flat on the desk, breathed, then made 3 calls in rapid succession. The first was to the FBI's Savannah Resident Agency duty officer. "I need a location confirmation on Agent Beckett. Last ping at Savannah PD Central Precinct. Possible compromise." The second was to the Assistant United States Attorney on call. "I need an emergency warrant package. Access to detention records, body cam footage, radio logs, and all documentation related to any person booked at Savannah PD Central Precinct between 1500 and 2200 hours today. Federal agent potentially in custody undercover identity. Name, Beckett, Nolan J." The third was to her team lead. "Wake up. I need 4 agents, transport ready, at the field office by 0500. Full credentials. Warrant service protocols. Bring everything." She hung up, opened her laptop, began pulling the operational file for clean sweep. 21 days of documentation, surveillance logs, evidence chains. The accumulated work of a man who was, at this very moment, sitting in a holding cell in a precinct he'd been sent to investigate, waiting for the system he served to find him before the system he was exposing destroyed what he'd built. Okafor didn't know the details yet. Didn't know about Garland or Pratt or Delaney or the BOLO that didn't exist. Didn't know about the notebook in Pratt's locked drawer or the phone in an evidence bag without a property inventory form. But she knew Nolan Beckett. Knew that if he was silent, it was because speaking would compromise the mission. Knew that if he was detained, it was because he'd chosen detention over exposure. Knew that he was sitting in that cell right now, documenting everything, organizing every detail, building the case with the same patient, meticulous, almost inhuman discipline that had made him the best undercover agent she'd ever supervised. And she knew, with the certainty of a woman who'd spent 20 years in federal law enforcement and had learned that the worst abuses of power happen not in the shadows, but in the light. Not in secret, but in plain view. Not by accident, but by design. That whatever had happened to her agent today was not going to go unanswered. She looked at the clock. 10:23 p.m. 7 hours until the warrant was ready. 7 hours until her team was assembled. 7 hours until she walked into that precinct and showed every officer inside what it looked like when the federal government came to collect one of its own. 7 hours. Nolan would wait. He was good at waiting. It was, perhaps, the thing he was best at, the ability to sit still while the world made mistakes around him, to let people reveal themselves through their actions, to trust that time was an ally rather than an enemy. But 7 hours was a long time in a holding cell, and the people who had put him there didn't know what they'd done, didn't know who they were holding, didn't know that every minute he sat on that metal bench was another minute of evidence, another minute of documentation, another minute of the quiet, relentless accumulation that would, by morning, become the most consequential arrest any of them had ever made. Not Nolan's arrest, theirs. At 11:55 p.m., the holding cell door opened one more time. Not Pratt, not Garland, not Amara Lee. Delaney. He stood in the doorway with his hands in his pockets and the expression of a man who'd come to check on a problem he'd helped create. Off-duty clothes, jeans, a windbreaker, sneakers, no badge visible, no radio, no official reason to be in the holding area of a precinct at midnight. Nolan opened his eyes, looked at Delaney, said nothing. Just wanted to check on our guest, Delaney said. His voice carried the false warmth of someone performing concern while calculating risk. Make sure you're comfortable. I'm in a cell without charges, without a phone call, and without my property. Comfortable isn't the word I'd use. These things take time. Bureaucracy, you know. Delaney stepped inside the cell. 1 step, 2. Close enough to lower his voice. Listen, Beckett. I don't know what your deal is. Maybe you really are just some real estate guy who got caught in the wrong place. But between you and me, the more you cooperate, the faster this goes. Fight the process, and the process fights back. That's just how it works. Is that a threat, officer? It's advice. Delaney's eyes moved, not to Nolan's face, to his hands, checking for tension, for fists, for the physical tells that preceded violence or resistance. Finding neither. Finding only a man sitting still with his palms on his knees and an expression that gave nothing away. Where's my notebook? Nolan asked. Delaney's face was very good, controlled. But the pause, half a second, maybe less, told Nolan everything. The notebook was no longer in the evidence chain. It was somewhere else, in someone's hands, being read. Your property will be returned when you're released, Delaney said. That's not what I asked. The two men looked at each other. The holding cell's fluorescent light hummed. The ventilation pushed stale air between them. Something passed in the silence. Not a threat, not a confession, but a recognition. Two people who understood that this encounter was about more than a sidewalk stop and a missing notebook. Two people who could feel the shape of something larger pressing against the walls of this small room, something that neither of them could fully see, but that both of them knew was there. Delaney left without another word. The door closed. The lock engaged. Nolan sat in the silence that followed and added one more entry to the record he was building inside his head. 23:55 hours. Officer Delaney visited cell. Off duty. No stated purpose. Asked about cooperation. Inquired about my deal. Possible fishing for information about my actual identity or purpose. Body language suggested awareness of notebook contents. Duration of visit, approximately 2 minutes. No physical contact. No threats. Explicit. Implicit pressure to cooperate. Possible intimidation. He closed his eyes again. The fluorescent light buzzed. The precinct settled into its midnight rhythms. Quieter, slower. The skeleton crew manning desks and radios while the city outside slept. 7 hours until morning. And if you think you know where this story is going, trust me, you don't. Stay right here, because the reveal that's coming will change everything. At 5:03 a.m. on Friday, October 10th, Kip Delaney called in sick. The desk sergeant, a night shift veteran named Lorraine Price, who'd been answering phones at Central Precinct since before Delaney was old enough to vote, logged the call without comment. Sick days happened. Officers used them for hangovers, mental health breaks, family emergencies, and occasionally, though no one discussed this openly, for the strategic absence that allowed them to be somewhere else when something inconvenient happened at work. Price had seen enough strategic absences to recognize one. But recognizing and reporting were different actions, separated by the institutional understanding that some things you noticed, and some things you remembered, and some things you quietly forgot, because remembering them made your own life harder. She logged the sick day and returned to her crossword puzzle. At 5:45 a.m., Nolan Beckett stood up from the metal bench for the first time in 3 hours. He stretched, methodically, the way someone stretches who has been trained to maintain physical readiness even in confinement. Shoulders, neck, lower back, hamstrings. Each stretch held for precisely 10 seconds, a routine that looked like habit but was actually protocol, the operational fitness protocol taught to agents who might need to move quickly after extended periods of stillness. 14 hours in the cell, no phone call, no charges, no attorney, no property inventory. No one had brought food or water since Amara Lee's cup at 10 p.m. 14 hours of documentation. He knew by now the shift change schedule, knew the approximate timing of radio traffic spikes, knew which officers had passed his cell door and at what intervals, knew that Pratt had left the precinct at approximately 11 p.m. and that Garland's patrol car was still in the lot. The rookie was somewhere in the building, probably at a desk, probably staring at a report he couldn't figure out how to write. Knew that Delaney had visited, off-duty, midnight, alone. That detail, more than the arrest, more than the BOLO, more than any single violation in the long chain of violations that had defined the past 14 hours, told Nolan the most about what he was dealing with. An officer who comes to a precinct off-duty at midnight to visit a detainee he helped arrest is not performing police work. He is managing a situation, checking on an investment, making sure the thing he helped build is still holding together, which meant Delaney was not a bystander who'd offered a convenient BOLO match. He was a participant, someone who had a reason, personal, professional, or financial, to ensure that Nolan Beckett remained in custody, remained silent, remained contained. The question was why? And the answer was somewhere in the 21 days of data that Nolan had collected before yesterday, in the patrol patterns, in the stop records, in the complaints filed and dismissed, in the money that moved through systems designed to be invisible. The answer was in the notebook that Pratt had locked in his drawer, and the answer would survive regardless. Because Nolan Beckett had learned, very early in his career, that evidence existed in multiple forms. Paper could be destroyed, digital files could be deleted, notebooks could be stolen. But the documentation inside a trained agent's mind, the timestamps, the badge numbers, the verbatim quotes, the physical observations, those survived everything except the agent himself, and he was still here. At 6:02 a.m., the first light of Friday morning slipped through the narrow window near the ceiling of the holding cell, a slit of reinforced glass that was too small to crawl through and too high to look out of, but that told him, with the certainty of sunrise, that the longest night of his career was ending. The machinery was coming. He could feel it the way experienced agents felt operational shifts, not through information but through pattern recognition, through the understanding that systems responded to disruptions with predictable speed, that missed check-ins triggered protocols, that protocols triggered people, that people triggered action. Denise Okafor was coming. He was as sure of this as he was of the sunrise filtering through that slit of glass. Okafor, who had supervised him for 3 years, and who understood, perhaps better than anyone in the Bureau, that Nolan's silence was not a sign of distress, but a tactical choice, that his patience was not passivity, but strategy, that the man sitting in this cell was not a victim, but a weapon that had been aimed, by accident and by design, at the very institution holding him. She would come, with warrants, with agents, with the full weight of the federal government behind her, and the calm, surgical precision that had made her the most effective ASAC in the Savannah office's history. She would come, and when she did, every officer who had touched this case, Garland, Pratt, Delaney, Sheridan, would understand, in the space of a single moment, the magnitude of what they had done. Not because they had arrested an FBI agent. That was bad enough. A career-ending mistake for some, a criminal liability for others. But because they had arrested a man who had spent 21 days documenting their violations, who had watched them stop black drivers without cause and write reports that transformed illegal searches into consent encounters, who had logged the patrol patterns that targeted certain neighborhoods and ignored others, who had mapped the complaint process that received 63 citizen allegations in 3 years and sustained exactly 0. They had arrested the evidence. And now the evidence was about to speak. Nolan sat back down on the metal bench, straightened his glasses, placed his hands on his knees, and waited, one last time, for the door to open. At 6:15 a.m. on Friday, October 10th, 2 black Chevrolet Suburbans with federal plates turned onto Habersham Street in formation, the kind of synchronized arrival that required planning, not coincidence. The lead vehicle's tinted windows reflected the early morning light, turning the glass into mirrors that showed Savannah waking up around them. A man walking a terrier. a delivery truck idling outside a bakery, a jogger crossing at the light without looking up from her phone. None of them noticed the SUVs. Federal vehicles were designed not to be noticed. Dark paint, government plates that most civilians couldn't distinguish from fleet vehicles, and an anonymity that came from looking expensive but uninteresting, the opposite of a patrol car's deliberate visibility. ASAC. Denise Okafor sat in the passenger seat of the lead vehicle reviewing the warrant package one final time. She'd been awake since 10:17 the previous night. 7 hours and 58 minutes of preparation compressed into a manila folder that contained 4 signed warrants, 2 federal subpoenas, and a letter of authorization from the United States Attorney for the Southern District of Georgia. The warrants covered everything: detention records, body cam footage, radio communications logs, property inventory files, personnel records for every officer who had contact with the detainee. The subpoenas targeted the 911 call recording and the precinct's internal surveillance system. The letter of authorization, the piece that mattered most, was a single page on Department of Justice letterhead. It identified Nolan J. Beckett as a supervisory special agent assigned to Operation Clean Sweep, a pattern or practice investigation authorized under 34 U.S.C. Section 12601. It directed the Savannah Police Department to release Agent Beckett immediately, to preserve all evidence related to his detention, and to cooperate fully with the FBI's inquiry into the circumstances of his arrest. The letter was signed by the United States Attorney herself, at 4:37 a.m. on a Friday morning from her home, which told Okafor everything she needed to know about how seriously the department was taking this. Okafor closed the folder, looked at the 4 agents in the 2 vehicles, experienced, steady, chosen for this because they understood that what was about to happen required precision, not force. The goal was not confrontation. The goal was retrieval, preservation, and the controlled application of federal authority in a way that left no room for ambiguity. "Credentials visible," she said into the radio. "Professional demeanor. We're not here to make enemies. We're here to collect our agent and secure evidence. Let the warrants do the talking." The SUVs turned onto the street that led to Central Precinct. The building materialized ahead. 2 stories of beige brick and institutional architecture, American flag hanging limp in the windless morning, parking lot half full with patrol cars and personal vehicles. Okafor stepped out first, 51 years old, trim, dark suit that fit the way suits fit when they're tailored for someone who wears them every day and considers them work equipment rather than fashion. Her FBI credentials hung from a lanyard around her neck, badge and photo ID, the gold shield catching the first rays of morning sun. She walked through the front entrance without pausing. The lobby, fluorescent lights, linoleum floor, bulletin board covered in department notices and community event flyers, was occupied by a desk sergeant, a civilian clerk, and a patrol officer filling out paperwork at a side table. The desk sergeant looked up. Lorraine Price, the same night shift veteran who had logged Delaney's sick call 3 hours earlier. Her crossword puzzle sat half-finished next to the phone. She registered the credentials, the suit, the 3 agents fanning out behind Okafor, and the expression on the ASAC's face, which was not angry, not aggressive, but absolutely unmistakably final. "Good morning." Okafor set her credentials case on the counter, open, badge facing up. "ASAC, Denise Okafor, FBI Savannah Field Office. I'm here for the immediate release of a federal employee currently being held in your facility. His name is Nolan Beckett. He was detained yesterday afternoon and has been held without charges for approximately 14 hours. Price reached for her phone. Her hand was steady. She'd been doing this job for 19 years and had seen federal agents before, though never at 6:15 on a Friday morning with warrant folders under their arms. "I'll need to contact the watch commander." "By all means." Okafor set the warrant folder on the counter beside her credentials. "While you do that, I'm serving these. Federal warrants for all documentation related to Mr. Beckett's detention. Booking records, body cam footage, radio logs, property inventory, and internal surveillance recordings. Your department has 30 minutes to begin compliance." Price picked up the phone, dialed an extension. Her eyes stayed on the warrant folder. "Lieutenant, it's Price. You need to come up front. We have a situation." The word traveled through the precinct the way all words travel through institutions, unevenly, carried by whispers and glances and the particular quality of footsteps that accelerated without quite running. Within 4 minutes, 3 people had converged on the front lobby: the night shift watch commander, a desk officer who'd heard FBI and couldn't resist, and, arriving last, coffee mug in hand, uniform pressed with the crispness of someone who had not expected to start her Friday this way, Lieutenant Blythe Sheridan. Sheridan set the coffee down on the nearest flat surface. It was an unconscious gesture, the shedding of a comfort object when comfort was no longer available, and Okafor noted it the way she noted everything, quickly, precisely, without visible reaction. "Lieutenant Sheridan." Okafor did not extend her hand. The omission was deliberate, not rudeness but a signal. This was not a meeting between colleagues. This was a notification. "I believe you signed the authorization for Mr. Beckett's extended hold last night at approximately 7:12 p.m. The statement was not a question. Its precision, the exact time, the exact action, landed in the lobby like a stone dropped into still water. Sheridan's face registered the impact, not shock. She was too experienced for shock. Something worse: recognition. The recognition of a person who has just been told that someone knows exactly what she did and exactly when she did it. Yes, based on Sergeant Pratt's report, the subject matched a BOLO bateau. The BOLO was canceled on October 6th, 3 days before your officer cited it. Your department's own database confirms that the cancellation was distributed to all active units. Okafor's voice didn't rise, didn't sharpen, stayed level and clear, the way a surgeon's hands stay steady, not because the work is easy, but because steadiness is the only option. "Lieutenant, where is Mr. Beckett right now?" "Holding area, downstairs." "Take me to him." The walk from the lobby to the holding area took 90 seconds. In that 90 seconds, Okafor passed the processing desk where Garland had stood 14 hours earlier with his hand on Nolan's elbow, past the corridor where Pratt had called Delaney and gotten voicemail, past the interview room where Pratt had watched a man quote statute numbers with the precision of a federal prosecutor and had felt, without understanding, the ground shifting beneath him. The holding cell door opened. Nolan Beckett sat on the metal bench. Same posture he'd held for most of the night. Back straight, hands on knees, glasses still slightly crooked from the arrest that now felt like it had happened in a different century. He looked up when the door opened, saw Okafor, saw the credentials around her neck, the warrant folder in her hand, the agents positioned in the corridor behind her. His expression didn't change. Not relief, not triumph, not even acknowledgement. At least, not the kind that civilians would recognize. What passed between Okafor and Beckett in that moment was something else. The silent communication of professionals who had worked together long enough to understand that the operation had entered its final phase, that the cover was blown, but the evidence was intact, that everything from this point forward would happen in daylight rather than shadow. Okafor turned to Sheridan. "Uncuff him." "He's not cuffed. We removed them during Then clear the corridor. I need to speak with my agent privately." The words, "my agent," detonated in the hallway with the force of a controlled demolition. Sheridan took a physical step backward. Behind her, the watch commander's hand moved to his radio and stopped, frozen by the understanding that there was no one to call, no protocol to invoke, no institutional mechanism that could undo what had just been said. My agent. Federal. Their detainee was federal. Okafor stepped into the cell, closed the door, stood across from Nolan in the narrow space between the bench and the wall. "Status," she said. "Intact. No injuries beyond the cuffs. Surface abrasions, both wrists. Detained at approximately 15:32 yesterday. No charges filed. No Miranda advisement. No phone call. I made 3 requests, all denied. Phone and notebook confiscated without property inventory documentation. The phone is a bureau-issued secure device. The notebook contains 21 days of operational notes for clean sweep. The notebook, where is it now? Sergeant Pratt took possession. I believe he read it. Whether he copied or photographed the contents, I can't confirm. But his behavior after reviewing it, specifically a call to Officer Delaney at approximately 2300 hours, suggests he recognized the material wasn't civilian notes. Okafor processed this. The notebook was a problem. Not because its contents would compromise the investigation, the data existed in triplicate on Bureau servers, but because a local sergeant had potentially accessed operational intelligence about an active federal investigation. That was a security breach. And security breaches triggered their own cascading protocols. Delaney, Okafor said. Tell me about Delaney. Kip Delaney, badge 5133, 7 years on the force. He arrived at the scene after my arrest and provided a BOLO reference, number BL-24-03-17, to justify upgrading the detention. The BOLO was invalid, canceled on October 6th, 3 days prior. He fabricated the match on the restricted radio channel. And he visited my cell at approximately 23:55 hours, off duty. No stated reason. Suggested I cooperate. Asked what my deal was, possible phishing for my actual identity. His body language when I asked about the notebook suggested he knew Pratt had it. He called in sick this morning, 0503. Nolan's eyes narrowed, the first visible reaction he'd shown in 14 hours. Before our arrival time, someone tipped him. That's our working assumption. We'll pull the phone records. She opened the warrant folder, removed the DOJ letter, held it up, not for Nolan, who didn't need to see it, but for the camera in the corner of the ceiling that was almost certainly recording. Agent Beckett, you're released from local custody effective immediately under federal authority. Operation Clean Sweep remains active. All evidence collected during your detention is now subject to federal preservation orders. She opened the cell door, stepped into the corridor where Sheridan, the watch commander, and 2 uniformed officers stood in the particular formation of people who want to be somewhere else but can't figure out how to leave without making things worse. Lieutenant Sheridan, I need the following within 30 minutes. Officer Garland, Sergeant Pratt, and any officer who had contact with Mr. Beckett during his detention. Conference room. I also need Beckett's confiscated property. Phone, notebook, wallet, all personal items. Delivered to me in their current state. Do not inventory them. Do not process them. Do not touch them further. They are now federal evidence. Sheridan nodded. The nod of someone who has passed the point of resistance and entered the territory of compliance. Not because she agreed, but because the alternative was worse than agreement. And Lieutenant? Okafor paused. The pause was calculated, the way all pauses from experienced federal agents were calculated. Who authorized the extended hold? Sheridan's jaw tightened. I did, based on Sergeant Pratt's report. Did you review the body cam footage before signing? No. Did you listen to the 911 call? No. Did you interview the detainee? No. Did you verify the BOLO reference independently? No. 4 questions. 4 answers. Each one a brick in a wall that was building itself around Blythe Sheridan's 22-year career, and she could see it happening, could feel each no landing like a nail driven into something she'd spent decades constructing, but couldn't stop it, because the truth was the truth, and the truth was that she had signed a document authorizing the imprisonment of a United States citizen based on a report she hadn't verified, evidence she hadn't reviewed, and a BOLO that didn't exist. Those responses are noted, Okafor said. Please have everyone assembled in 20 minutes. She walked toward the processing area. Nolan fell into step beside her, moving easily despite 14 hours of confinement, his body shifting from stillness to motion with the practiced efficiency of someone who had trained himself to be ready for exactly this. In the processing area, an evidence bag sat on the counter. Nolan's phone, government-issued, encrypted, currently powered down. His wallet. His keys. A pen. No notebook. Where is the moleskin notebook that was in Mr. Beckett's possession at the time of arrest? Okafor addressed the question to the room. 3 officers occupied the space, 2 pretending to do paperwork, 1 staring at a computer screen that he almost certainly wasn't reading. Silence. I'll ask once more. A black moleskin notebook, grid-ruled, approximately 5 by 8 inches. It was taken from Mr. Beckett's person during his arrest yesterday afternoon. It is not in the evidence bag. Where is it? The officer at the computer cleared his throat. Sergeant Pratt may have... I think he was reviewing it last night. For the report. Is Sergeant Pratt in the building? Not yet. His shift starts at 0700. Okafor checked her watch. 6:29. 31 minutes until Pratt arrived for his shift, assuming he arrived at all, assuming he hadn't received the same tip that had sent Delaney calling in sick. She turned to one of her agents. Contact Sergeant Vernon Pratt at his home address. Inform him that his presence is required at Central Precinct immediately and that a federal warrant for his testimony has been issued. If he's not here by 0730, we'll collect him. The agent stepped away, phone already at his ear. Nolan examined his phone, powered it on. The screen lit up, cracked, a hairline fracture running diagonally across the glass from where it had been handled without care. But functional. The encryption held. No evidence of attempted access. He checked the secure messaging system. 14 hours of missed check-ins stacked in the log like dominoes. Each one a timestamp. Each timestamp a piece of evidence. The system had worked exactly as designed, flagging his absence, alerting Okafor, triggering the protocols that had brought 4 agents to this precinct at dawn. He slipped the phone into his pocket, picked up the wallet, the keys, the pen. Did not ask about the notebook again, not because it didn't matter, but because he understood that the notebook's absence was, in its own way, more valuable than its presence. A missing piece of evidence told a story, the story of someone who had taken it, read it, and decided it was too important, or too dangerous, to return. That story would be told later, in depositions, in hearings, in the kind of rooms where missing evidence was not a minor clerical error, but a federal crime. The conference room occupied the 2nd floor of Central Precinct, a windowless rectangle with a long table, 12 chairs, a whiteboard still bearing the dry erase remnants of the previous day's shift briefing, and a projection screen that no one had used in months. The American flag stood in the corner, a framed photograph of the chief of police hung on the wall, smiling, dress uniform, the image of institutional confidence. By 6:52, the room held the following people. A.S., A.C., Denise Okafor, seated at the head of the table. Warrant folder open. Nolan Beckett, seated to her right. Quiet. Glasses straightened for the first time in 14 hours. Hands folded on the table in front of him. Lieutenant Blythe Sheridan, seated at the far end. Coffee mug brought from downstairs, untouched, going cold. Officer Trey Garland standing near the door. He'd been called in from the break room where he'd spent the night on a couch, unable to go home, unable to sleep, unable to do anything except stare at the ceiling and replay the moment he'd grabbed Nolan Beckett's wrist and spun him around on a Savannah sidewalk. He looked, in the fluorescent light of the conference room, approximately 10 years older than he had 20 hours ago. Sergeant Vernon Pratt arrived at 7:04, 3 minutes after being called. He'd driven fast. Okafor could tell because his shirt was half-tucked and his hair bore the imprint of a pillow. He entered the conference room, saw the FBI credentials on the table, saw Nolan Beckett sitting where a detainee should not be sitting, and stopped in the doorway. The stop lasted 2 seconds. In those 2 seconds, Pratt's face performed a performance, the rapid, involuntary sequence of expressions that happens when a person encounters a reality that contradicts every assumption they've been operating under. Confusion. Recognition. Calculation. And finally, landing like a bird on a wire, the controlled neutrality of a man who has decided to reveal nothing until he understands everything. He sat down without being asked. Officer Kip Delaney was absent. His chair remained empty. A visual accusation more effective than any words. Okafor let the silence hold for 10 seconds, long enough for the weight of the situation to settle on every person in the room, long enough for Garland's leg to start bouncing under the table, nervous energy with nowhere to go, long enough for Pratt to look at the warrant folder and understand that whatever he was about to hear had the full backing of the federal judiciary. Then she opened the folder. At 15:27 hours yesterday, a 911 call was placed by a resident of Ardsley Park reporting a... She glanced at the transcript. Quote, black male, mid-30s, standing in front of a property, writing in a notebook. End quote. The caller described no criminal activity, no weapon, no attempted entry, no threat. The sole basis for the call was the presence of a black man on a public sidewalk. She set the transcript aside, pulled out the next document. Officer Garland responded, contacted the subject, ran an NCIC check that returned clean, no warrants, no criminal history, valid Georgia driver's license. At that point, the legal basis for continued detention was zero. The subject was on a public sidewalk. He had committed no crime. He had provided valid identification. The appropriate action was to clear the call and move on. Garland's legs stopped bouncing. He stared at the table. Instead, Officer Garland placed the subject in handcuffs. The stated basis, suspicious activity, possible trespassing, was legally insufficient. Georgia Code Section 16-7-21 defines trespassing as being on private property after being asked to leave or in the presence of posted signage. The subject was on a public sidewalk. Neither condition was met. She turned to the next document. Her voice remained level. The steadiness of a person who understood that volume was the enemy of authority, that the most devastating statements were delivered quietly. Following the arrest, Sergeant Pratt arrived and assumed supervisory control. Rather than correcting the deficient arrest, Sergeant Pratt chose to... She paused, selecting the word with visible care. Construct a justification. He directed transport to the precinct for an investigative hold, a classification that does not exist under Georgia detention law. Pratt's hands lay flat on the table, very still. The stillness of a man who is consciously preventing his body from revealing what his mind is processing. At 15:51 hours, Officer Delaney, who is not present today and who called in sick at 05:03 this morning, transmitted on restricted radio channel 3, a reference to BOLO number BL-24-0-3-17, describing an IC-3, male, mid-30s, medium build, allegedly matching the subject. Okafor pulled out a single sheet of paper, held it up so everyone in the room could see it. This is a printout from the Chatham County BOLO database. BOLO number BL-24-0-3-17 was issued on October 3rd in connection with a residential burglary series. It was canceled on October 6th at 1100 hours, following the identification and arrest of the actual suspect. The cancellation was distributed electronically to all active patrol units in the county, including Officer Delaney's. She set the paper down. Officer Delaney cited a non-existent active alert to manufacture probable cause for an arrest that had no legal basis. That constitutes falsification of official records under Georgia Code Section 16-10-20 and potential obstruction of justice under 18 U.S.C. Section 1519. The room was silent, the kind of silence that has texture, dense, pressurized, the air itself seeming to thicken as the facts accumulated. Okafor turned to the body cam analysis. Officer Garland's body-worn camera, serial number BC4712-9, shows a 12-minute gap in recording. The footage cuts at 15:41 and resumes at 15:53. Department Policy, Savannah PD General Order 12-07, mandates continuous recording during all citizen contacts. The gap coincides precisely with Sergeant Pratt's arrival at the scene and his initial conversation with Officer Garland. She looked directly at Pratt. Metadata analysis conducted by our forensic technicians this morning confirms that the camera was manually paused at 15:41. Not a battery failure, not a malfunction, a deliberate action. Pratt's jaw muscles worked, a slow, grinding motion, the physical manifestation of words being chewed and swallowed rather than spoken. "Agent Beckett," Okafor said, turning to Nolan for the first time since the briefing began. "Can you describe what occurred during the 12 minutes not captured by Officer Garland's body cam?" Nolan spoke for the first time. His voice, quiet, precise, carrying the same cadence he'd used throughout his detention, filled the conference room with the quality of testimony rather than conversation. At approximately 15:41, Sergeant Pratt arrived at the scene. He approached Officer Garland and spoke to him privately, though I could hear the conversation from my position beside the patrol car. Sergeant Pratt's first words were, and I am quoting verbatim, "What do you have?" Officer Garland described the 911 call and the address mismatch. Sergeant Pratt responded, again, verbatim, "That'll work. Let me handle the narrative." He then instructed Officer Garland to turn off his body cam. His exact words were, "Turn it off. Battery's acting up. I'll note it in the report." The words landed in the room like evidence bags dropped on a courtroom table. Heavy, labeled, impossible to ignore. Garland's face had gone the color of old paper. Pratt stared straight ahead, his expression the controlled blank of a man who was hearing his own words repeated back to him and understanding, for the first time, that someone had been listening with the ear of a professional witness. "Let me handle the narrative," Okafor repeated, slowly, letting each word occupy its own space. "Sergeant, do you recall making that statement?" Pratt's response came after a pause long enough to measure. "I may have said something along those lines. It was a fast-moving situation. I was trying to help my officer manage a complex encounter." "A complex encounter," Okafor repeated. "A man standing on a sidewalk with a notebook. That's your definition of complex." Pratt didn't answer. Okafor pulled out the final document in the stack, held it flat on the table with both palms. This was the one that mattered, the one that would transform everything that had happened in the past 14 hours from a series of police misconduct incidents into a federal catastrophe. This is the authorization letter for Operation Clean Sweep, issued by the Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division. It identifies the man sitting to my right, Nolan J. Beckett, as a supervisory special agent with the FBI assigned to an undercover investigation of the Savannah Police Department. She let the sentence complete itself before continuing. Let it reach every corner of the room. Let it settle into every pair of ears. Agent Beckett has been operating in Savannah for 21 days under civilian cover. His assignment? To investigate and document a pattern or practice of civil rights violations within this department. Specifically, racially motivated stops, fabricated probable cause, body cam manipulation, and systemic suppression of citizen complaints. Garland made a sound. Small, involuntary. The sound of a person whose stomach drops from a height. The sound of realizing. During those 21 days, Agent Beckett documented 14 instances of racially motivated stops. 7 false BOLO citations, of which yesterday's was the most recent. 3 fabricated arrest reports, and a complaint process that received 63 citizen allegations over the past 3 years and sustained exactly 0. She looked at Sheridan, looked at Pratt, looked at Garland, whose eyes had gone glassy with the particular shine of someone fighting not to let his face collapse in front of his superiors. Yesterday, your officers arrested the federal agent investigating their department. They held him for 14 hours without charges. They denied him his phone call 3 times. They confiscated a government-issued secure communications device without documentation. They fabricated a BOLO match to justify the detention. They manually paused a body cam to conceal a conversation about constructing a false narrative. And they took custody of a notebook containing 21 days of federal investigative data, a notebook that, as of this morning, has not been returned. She turned to Pratt. "Sergeant, where is the notebook?" The room waited, The fluorescent lights hummed. The flag in the corner hung limp. Pratt looked at the table, at his hands, at the table again. Then he reached into his jacket pocket, withdrew a key, small, brass, the kind that fit a desk drawer, and set it on the table between them. "My desk, second floor, locked drawer. Did you read it?" Silence. "Sergeant Pratt, did you read the contents of the notebook?" "I reviewed it, briefly, to determine whether the subject's claim of being a real estate consultant was—" "You read 21 days of federal investigative notes, operational intelligence from an active DOJ investigation, without authorization, without clearance, without understanding what you were looking at." Pratt's mouth opened, closed, opened again. "I didn't know what it was." "No," Okafor said, "you didn't, because you didn't ask. Because at no point during the 14 hours you held Agent Beckett did any officer in this precinct take the basic investigative step of verifying who he was. You had his name, his license, his clean record, his knowledge of criminal procedure, his calm. Every indicator that this man was not what you assumed, and you assumed anyway, because assumption was easier than investigation." She stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate, not dramatic, but final, the way a judge rises before delivering a verdict. "Let me be clear about what happens next. This is not a negotiation. These are consequences." She outlined them in order. Voice level, no inflection. The facts arranged like bricks in a wall that none of them would be able to climb. 1. Officer Garland is suspended from duty effective immediately, pending internal affairs review of the arrest. His body cam footage, arrest report, and all associated documentation are now federal evidence. 2. Sergeant Pratt is suspended from duty effective immediately, pending investigation into the body cam deactivation, the unauthorized access to federal investigative materials, and the construction of a false arrest narrative. Potential charges include obstruction under 18 U.S.C. Section 1519 and unauthorized access to classified materials. 3. Officer Delaney's absence today does not shield him from inquiry. We will be serving him with a federal subpoena for testimony regarding the fabricated Bolo citation. His radio transmissions, phone records, and financial records are subject to the warrants served this morning. 4. Lieutenant Sheridan will be interviewed regarding her authorization of the extended hold without independent verification. The DOJ's Office of Professional Responsibility has been notified. 5. The Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division, is opening a formal preliminary review of the Savannah Police Department under 34 U.S.C. Section 12601. The scope of the review will be determined based on Agent Beckett's 21 days of documentation and the circumstances of his arrest. 5 items. 5 careers. 5 futures altered in the space of 3 minutes. Garland was the first to break. Not loudly, not with protest or denial. He broke the way young men break when the thing they thought they were building turns out to be the thing that destroys them. His head dropped. His hands came up to his face. His shoulders shook once, a single tremor that he controlled before it became something he couldn't take back. 24 years old, 11 months on the force, 1 arrest. And it was the last arrest he would ever make as an officer of the Savannah Police Department, though he didn't know that yet. Didn't know that the administrative process winding its way through internal affairs would conclude, 4 months from now, with a finding of sustained on all counts and a recommendation for termination that the city's legal counsel would negotiate down to a voluntary resignation to avoid a lawsuit. He didn't know any of that. He just knew that the man he'd handcuffed on a Savannah sidewalk was watching him now with an expression that held no anger, no satisfaction, no judgment, only the steady, patient attention of someone who understood that this moment was not about punishment, but about truth, and that truth, once released, moved through institutions the way water moved through stone, slowly, inevitably, reshaping everything it touched. Pratt didn't break. He recalculated. 18 years of institutional survival had taught him that the first response to crisis was silence, the second was compliance, And the third, later in private with a union representative and an attorney, was strategy. He asked one question. "Am I being arrested?" Okafor shook her head. "Not at this time. You're being suspended pending investigation. Whether criminal charges are filed will depend on the outcome of the federal inquiry and the disposition of the notebook. I'd suggest you speak with an attorney." Pratt nodded, stood up, removed his badge, the gesture slow, almost ceremonial, as if he were performing a ritual he'd always known would come, but had hoped to postpone forever. He set it on the table, walked out of the conference room without looking at anyone. Sheridan remained seated. Her coffee was cold, her hands were folded in her lap. She looked at Okafor with the expression of someone who has just watched the foundation of a building crack and is waiting to see which walls fall first. "Lieutenant," Okafor said, "one more thing." Sheridan waited. Agent Beckett's investigation, Operation Clean Sweep, was not focused on individual officers. It was focused on the system that produces them, the culture that tells a rookie to arrest first and ask questions later, the supervision that rewards command presence over constitutional compliance, the oversight that signs extended hold authorizations without reading the underlying reports. Individual officers made individual choices yesterday, but those choices were made possible by institutional failures that go far beyond any single person. She paused. The DOJ review will examine those institutional failures. All of them. That's not a threat, Lieutenant. It's a notification. And I'd recommend your department begin its own internal assessment before the federal one makes it mandatory. Sheridan stood up. Her coffee mug remained on the table, abandoned, forgotten, as irrelevant as the 22-year career it had accompanied. "I'll notify the chief," she said. "The chief has already been notified. The U.S. Attorney's Office contacted him at 05:45 this morning." Sheridan absorbed this, nodded once, left. The conference room emptied until only Okafor and Nolan remained. The warrant folder lay open on the table. The brass key to Pratt's desk drawer sat beside it, like an artifact from an excavation, small, ordinary, and loaded with meaning. If you believe accountability matters, no matter who wears the badge, hit that like button and share this story. Because what happened in Savannah didn't stay in Savannah. The corridor outside the conference room was lined with officers who had found reasons to be nearby, filling water bottles, checking mailboxes, adjusting equipment that didn't need adjusting. The real reason was visible in their eyes, the need to see. To witness the moment when the quiet detainee from Cell 4 walked out of a conference room flanked by federal agents and wearing the invisible armor of an authority that outranked everything in the building. Nolan walked past them without acknowledgement. Not because he was above them, but because acknowledgement would have been a performance, and performance was the opposite of what this moment required. This moment required facts, evidence, the quiet accumulation of observations that would, eventually, be typed into a 200-page statement and filed in a federal case database. He noted 3 things as he passed. First, the officer nearest the water fountain, young, Hispanic, name tag reading Vega, met his eyes and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Not solidarity, not apology. Something more complicated, the recognition of a fellow human being who had been through something, delivered by someone who understood that delivering it openly was a risk. Second, a printed copy of Pratt's incident report sat face up on a desk near the bullpen entrance. Someone had left it visible, carelessly or deliberately, impossible to tell. Nolan's eyes caught the phrase non-compliant subject in the narrative field and registered it as evidence. A false characterization, documented on an official form, signed by a supervisor. Another brick. Third, the property room door was open. Inside, visible from the corridor, an evidence bag sat on a shelf. His evidence bag, the one containing his phone and wallet and keys. The bag was open, not sealed, not logged, not maintained with the chain of custody protocols that even the most basic police academy curriculum required. 3 observations. 15 seconds of walking. Another entry in the record that lived inside his head. At the end of the corridor, near the back exit that led to the parking lot, Garland stood alone. The rookie had left the conference room before the others, had walked out while Okafor was still speaking to Sheridan, moving with the stiff, mechanical gait of someone whose body was functioning on autopilot while his mind processed catastrophe. He'd ended up here, in the dead space between the corridor and the parking lot door, because going forward meant facing the world, and going backward meant facing the conference room, and neither direction offered anything he wanted to encounter. He looked up when Nolan approached. The look lasted 3 seconds, long enough for Nolan to see everything the young man's face contained: shame, fear, the dawning comprehension that the worst thing he'd ever done was not the arrest itself, but the decision that preceded it, the choice to value his evaluation over his judgment, to prioritize performance over principle, to reach for the handcuffs when every piece of evidence in front of him, clean record, valid ID, public sidewalk, no crime, told him to stop. Nolan paused, not to lecture, not to confront, not to deliver the kind of dramatic rebuke that stories like this were supposed to contain. He paused because the young man's face reminded him of something, a memory from his own early career, a moment when he'd made a different kind of mistake and had stood in a different kind of corridor, waiting for the consequences to arrive. Officer Garland, the name was neutral, the professional, carrying no heat. Garland's throat moved. A swallow. The word came out and stopped, stranded on the shore of everything he couldn't say. You have a good attorney, Nolan said. Listen to her, and whatever else happens, learn from this. That's not nothing. He walked past, through the door, into the parking lot, into the morning air that smelled like October and asphalt, and the particular Savannah mixture of river salt and magnolia that the city wore like perfume. Behind him, Trey Garland stood in the corridor and thought about learning. About whether learning was possible when the lesson had cost this much. About whether the man who'd just spoken to him with something that sounded almost like mercy had any idea what that mercy meant to a 24-year-old who had woken up yesterday believing he was becoming a police officer and had gone to sleep understanding that he had become a cautionary tale. Okafor found Nolan in the conference room 5 minutes later. The space was empty now, cleared of officers, cleared of tension, occupied only by the warrant folder on the table and the brass key and the residue of what had just happened. She looked at her agent, really looked, for the first time since the cell door opened, past the professional mask, past the operational discipline, past the patience that had kept him sitting on a metal bench for 14 hours without complaint. She saw the fatigue, the wrist abrasions, red and raw, visible where his shirt cuffs had ridden up. The crooked glasses he'd finally straightened, but that still sat slightly off-center, a reminder of the moment Garland had spun him around hard enough to knock them sideways. You all right, Nolan? The question, her first use of his first name since arriving, carried a different weight than the operational debriefing. It was the question of a supervisor who was also, after 7 years, something resembling a friend. 14 hours, he said. Not the worst I've had. The phone. They didn't attempt access. Encryption held. No signs of tampering on the device. The notebook is the concern. If Pratt read enough to understand the patrol pattern analysis, he may have communicated it to others before we arrived. Which brings us back to Delaney. Okafor leaned back in her chair. 5:03 sick call. Someone told him we were coming. His midnight visit to my cell was deliberate. He was assessing, trying to determine if I was civilian or something else. When he couldn't get a clear read, he hedged. Stayed home this morning just in case. Or someone with access to dispatch, or the watch commander's log, saw the federal warrant notification come through and tipped him. The implication hung between them. If Delaney had been tipped by someone inside the precinct, the corruption wasn't limited to 3 officers and a lieutenant. It extended into the communication channels, the infrastructure of the department itself. That's Phase 2, Okafor said. Nolan nodded, slowly. the nod of a man who understood that the work was not finished, that it was, in some ways, just beginning. Phase 1 had been observation, documentation, the patient accumulation of evidence from the outside. Phase 2 would be different, deeper. The investigation would move from the street into the internal mechanisms of the department, personnel files, financial records, communication logs, the institutional plumbing that connected individual officers to systemic behavior. "We need to retrieve the notebook first," Nolan said, "and have forensics determine whether the pages were copied or photographed." Already in motion, Agent Torres is pulling it now. She checked her phone, read a message. Her expression tightened by a fraction. "Nolan, the notebook's been recovered, but Torres reports 3 pages are missing." "Which 3? 17, 18, and 19. Torn out." The silence that followed was heavier than any of the silences that had preceded it. 3 pages. 21 days of documentation, and someone had targeted 3 specific pages with the precision of a person who knew exactly what was on them. Nolan closed his eyes. Recalled. Page 17, 2 columns. Dates and patrol unit numbers, documenting a pattern of stops on West Broad Street targeting vehicles with out-of-state plates. Page 18, continuation, plus badge numbers of officers involved. Page 19, notes on a conversation he'd overheard at Sentient Bean between 2 officers discussing the program. A reference whose meaning he hadn't yet decoded, but that had sounded, in the careful phrasing of officers who knew they might be overheard, like something organized, something institutional, something that went beyond individual bias into coordinated action. 3 pages, and someone had known which 3 to take. "Pratt read the notebook around 2300 hours, Nolan said. "Delaney visited my cell at 23:55. By 05:03, Delaney was calling in sick. The timeline suggests Pratt identified the relevant pages, communicated their contents to someone, possibly Delaney, possibly someone else, and the pages were removed between Pratt's departure at approximately 2300 hours and our arrival at 06:15. That's a 7-hour window. Any officer with access to the precinct could have done it. But only someone who knew what those pages contained would have known which ones to take: Pratt, Delaney, or someone they told. Okafor stood up, gathered the warrant folder, the brass key, the weight of what was coming. "Get some rest," she said. "Eat something. I'll brief the U.S. Attorney at 0900. You'll need to provide a formal statement by Monday. Full chronology, 21 days plus the arrest. Everything you documented, everything you remember." "Everything I remember is everything that happened." She almost smiled. Almost. The ASAC's version of acknowledgement. The recognition that Nolan Beckett's memory was, in its own way, as reliable as any recording device and considerably harder to tamper with. She left the conference room. Nolan sat alone for a moment. The first true solitude he'd had since the cell, but different now. Not confinement, choice. The solitude of a man deciding what to do with the silence. He pulled out his phone, typed a secure message to the case file. Operation Clean Sweep. Field note. Date, October 10th. Agent, Beckett, NJ, SSA. Status, cover compromised. Detention documented. Evidence preserved, except pages 17 to 19 of field notebook. Removed by unknown party. BOLO fabrication, body cam tampering, and unauthorized access to federal materials confirmed. Phase 1 complete. Recommend Phase 2. Authorization, internal communications audit, financial records review, personnel file analysis for identified subjects, Garland, Pratt, Delaney, Sheridan. Priority, identify source of Delaney tip-off and determine disposition of missing notebook pages. He sent it, put the phone away, stood up. The walkout of Central Precinct took 45 seconds. Through the corridor, past the processing desk, through the lobby where Price still sat with her crossword puzzle, and the expression of someone who would be telling this story for the rest of her career, and out the front door into the morning. Savannah was fully awake now. Traffic on Habersham, The bakery open, the smell of bread reaching the sidewalk. The jogger long gone. The man with the terrier replaced by a woman pushing a stroller. The world continuing in its ordinary rhythms, unaware that inside the beige brick building behind him, careers were ending and investigations were beginning, and the machinery of federal accountability was grinding into motion with the slow, patient inevitability that characterized everything the DOJ touched. Nolan walked 3 blocks to Sentient Bean, ordered black coffee, sat at his corner table by the window. The barista, nose ring, SCAD sweatshirt, set the cup down without comment, though her eyes lingered on the red marks around his wrists. He drank the coffee, watched the intersection of Bull and Liberty. A patrol car passed at 7:12. Different unit, different officer, same route. The patterns continued. The system continued. The machinery continued. One arrest wouldn't change it. One reveal wouldn't fix it. One federal investigation, however thorough, however well documented, however supported by warrants and subpoenas and the authority of the United States Department of Justice, wouldn't transform the culture that had produced yesterday's encounter. Nolan knew this, had known it since his first year in the Bureau, when an instructor at Quantico had told his class something that had stayed with him ever since. You will not fix the system. The system is older than you, bigger than you, and more patient than you. What you can do, the only thing you can do, is document it so thoroughly that the people who come after you have the tools to hold it accountable. You are not the cure. You are the diagnosis, and diagnosis, done properly, is the first step toward treatment. 21 days of diagnosis, 14 hours of personal experience, 3 missing pages, 1 investigation opening, and the knowledge, earned, not assumed, that whatever came next would take months, not days. Years, not months. Would involve hearings and depositions and motions and counter-motions and the slow, grinding, often infuriating machinery of institutional accountability that moved at its own pace regardless of how urgent the injustice felt. The coffee was good. Strong, the chair was comfortable. The morning light through the window was warm. Nolan opened a new notebook, purchased from the rack by the register, spiral-bound, college-ruled, nothing like the moleskin that had been taken from him, and returned with 3 pages missing. He uncapped a pen and began to document. Again. 3 weeks later, the consequences arrived, not with the dramatic finality of a courtroom verdict, but with the slow, bureaucratic grinding that characterized institutional accountability in America. The headlines told one story. The reality told another. Detective Amara Lee, the internal affairs investigator who had visited Nolan's cell with a cup of water and the quiet professionalism of someone who noticed what others ignored, became the department's designated liaison to the FBI's inquiry. The appointment was, depending on who you asked, either a recognition of her integrity or a strategy to contain her. By placing Amara at the center of the federal interface, the department ensured that her instinct for detecting irregularities, the same instinct that had led her to Nolan's cell on the night of his detention, was channeled into cooperation rather than independent investigation. Amara understood the calculation, accepted the role anyway, because cooperation, even when it served the department's interests, also served the investigations. And she had seen the booking log, had seen the empty charge field, had looked through the observation window at a man sitting with his back straight and his eyes open, and had known, not suspected, known, that whatever was happening in that holding cell was wrong. She spent the first week assembling documentation, body cam files, radio logs, shift schedules, property room access records, the building blocks of accountability, gathered with the meticulous care of someone who understood that every document she pulled was simultaneously a service to the federal investigation and a potential threat to colleagues she'd worked beside for 15 years. The loneliness of that position, the specific, grinding isolation of being the person inside an institution who is responsible for holding that institution accountable, was something Amara had learned to live with, not comfortably, not happily, but with the stubborn, unglamorous determination of someone who believed that the badge meant something, and that the only way to protect that meaning was to confront the people who corrupted it. She filed her preliminary findings on day 12. 47 pages. The document landed on the chief's desk and on ASAC Okafor's desk simultaneously, a deliberate act of transparency that ensured neither side could claim exclusive access. The findings were clinical, devoid of opinion, devastating in their factual accumulation. 14 procedural violations documented during Nolan Beckett's detention, each one cross-referenced with the specific department policy and state or federal statute it violated. The chief read it in his office with the door closed. When he emerged, he looked like a man who had aged 5 years in 47 pages. Officer Trey Garland was suspended with pay, pending the outcome of an internal affairs investigation that would stretch across 4 months and produce a 112-page report examining every aspect of the October 9th arrest. The suspension, with pay, meant that Garland continued to receive his salary while sitting at home, a fact that the Savannah Morning News editorial board found sufficiently outrageous to devote 3 consecutive op-eds to, and that the Savannah Police Benevolent Association defended as standard procedure that protects officers' due process rights. His mother hired a private attorney, not the union-provided counsel, but a criminal defense specialist from Atlanta, who charged $400 an hour, and who immediately began constructing the narrative that would define Garland's defense. A young officer, inadequately trained, following the implicit instructions of his field training officer, acting in good faith on information provided by a fellow officer, not malicious, misguided, a product of the system, not a flaw in it. The narrative was partially true, which made it effective, which made it infuriating to everyone who understood that following orders was not a defense, but an explanation, and that the distinction between the two was exactly where justice lived. Sergeant Vernon Pratt was placed on administrative duty, reassigned from patrol supervision to records management in the basement of the precinct, a demotion so precisely humiliating that it needed no official designation to be understood by everyone in the department. His badge was not taken. His rank was not stripped. His pension was not threatened. But his authority, the 18 years of accumulated institutional power that had allowed him to say, "Let me handle the narrative," and have it obeyed, evaporated overnight. The union filed a grievance, argued that the body cam deactivation was a good-faith equipment management decision, and that the notebook review was appropriate investigative due diligence. The grievance would take 7 months to adjudicate. In the meantime, Pratt sat in a basement office, filing records, and waiting for a system he'd spent his career manipulating to decide his fate. The notebook pages remained missing. FBI forensics confirmed that pages 17, 18, and 19 had been physically torn from the binding. Trace evidence, a partial fingerprint on the torn edge of page 20, was recovered and submitted for analysis. Results were pending. Pratt denied removing the pages. Delaney, through his attorney, declined to answer questions about the notebook, invoking his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination, a legal protection that was his absolute right and that was, simultaneously, the loudest possible confession a silent man could make. Officer Kip Delaney never returned to duty. His sick call on October 10th extended into a second day, then a third, then an indefinite leave of absence that his attorney characterized as medical, and that the department's HR office processed without challenge. He was served with a federal subpoena at his apartment on October 15th. He accepted service through a crack in the door, said nothing, and closed it again. His radio transmissions from October 9th were analyzed in full. The restricted Channel 3 log confirmed what Nolan had heard and Okafor had presented. Delaney had cited a BOLO that had been canceled 3 days earlier. The transmission was time-stamped, recorded, and preserved on department servers that Delaney did not have the access or authority to alter. But the more significant finding was not the BOLO itself. It was what came before it. Phone records subpoenaed under the federal warrant showed that at 15:43 on October 9th, 8 minutes before his BOLO transmission, Delaney had received a text message from a number registered to a prepaid phone purchased with cash at a convenience store on Waters Avenue. The message content was unavailable. The prepaid phone had been deactivated within hours of the text, but the timing was devastating. 8 minutes before fabricating a BOLO, Delaney had received a communication from an untraceable source. Someone had told him to do it. Someone who knew about the arrest in real time. Someone who had the means and the motivation to ensure that Nolan Beckett's detention had a documented justification, however fraudulent. The prepaid phone was a dead end. But the dead end told its own story. A story of coordination, of planning, of a level of institutional sophistication that went beyond 3 officers making bad decisions on a Thursday afternoon. Lieutenant Blythe Sheridan was voluntarily reassigned from Field Command to the department's Professional Standards Bureau, a title that sounded like a promotion and functioned like an exile. She was not disciplined. She was not investigated. She was moved. Quietly, efficiently, with the institutional precision of an organization that understood the difference between accountability and optics. Her reassignment was announced in a department-wide email that used the phrase leadership development opportunity, language so transparently euphemistic that it became, among the rank-and-file officers who read it, an instant and enduring joke. For years afterward, whenever an officer was sidelined, demoted, or otherwise removed from a position of authority, someone would inevitably crack. Must be a leadership development opportunity. Sheridan accepted the reassignment without public comment. Privately, according to sources who later spoke to the Savannah Morning News, she told a colleague, 22 years, and I signed one piece of paper. That's all it took. The Department of Justice moved at its own pace. 4 weeks after the arrest, the Civil Rights Division formally opened a preliminary review of the Savannah Police Department under 34 U.S.C. Section 12601, the federal statute that authorized pattern or practice investigations of law enforcement agencies. The review would examine 5 years of data, arrest records, use of force incidents, complaint files, training protocols, and the disciplinary processes that had, by Nolan's documentation, sustained 0 citizen complaints in 36 months. The scope was broad. The timeline was long. Preliminary findings were not expected for 12 to 18 months. A full consent decree, the federal court order that would mandate specific reforms, could take 3 to 5 years. The system protected itself. The system always protected itself. Unions negotiated, attorneys maneuvered, processes stretched. The language of accountability, investigation, review, preliminary findings, pending, became its own form of delay, not because the people using it were insincere, but because the machinery of institutional change was built for caution, not speed. And the difference between those two things was where most people's patience ran out. But the machinery had started, and once started, it didn't stop. Felicia Greer's video, 4 minutes and 17 seconds of cell phone footage showing a man being handcuffed on a Savannah sidewalk for the crime of holding a notebook, was viewed 900,000 times in the first week after it was uploaded. The comment section filled with the usual mixture of outrage, solidarity, trolling, and the particular American ritual of debating whether what everyone could plainly see had actually happened. Felicia herself was interviewed by 3 local news stations and 1 national outlet. She said the same thing each time. He was just standing there. That's it. Standing there with a notebook. And they put him in handcuffs, in broad daylight, in front of his own house. The phrase, in front of his own house, became a refrain, repeated, hashtagged, printed on signs that appeared at a community rally organized 2 weeks after the arrest. The rally drew 400 people to Forsyth Park, where speakers talked about policing and profiling and the particular exhaustion of being black in a neighborhood that treated your presence as probable cause. Attorney Jasper Hollins, a civil rights lawyer who operated a 2-person firm on Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard and who had spent 12 years filing complaints that the department sustained at a rate of exactly 0%, stood on the park's bandstand and delivered remarks that the Savannah Morning News would later describe as measured but unsparing. This department has received 63 citizen complaints in 3 years, Hollins said, his voice carrying across the crowd without amplification. 63 people walked into a precinct, sat down with an internal affairs detective and said, "Something wrong happened to me." And 63 times the department investigated itself and found nothing. 0 sustained complaints, not one. That's not a finding. That's a policy. A policy of institutional self-protection that tells citizens their experiences don't matter, that their complaints will be received and filed and forgotten. Agent Beckett's documentation confirms what this community has known for years, that the system is designed to protect itself, not the people it serves. Hollins had been retained by 3 of the 14 individuals whose traffic stops Nolan had documented during his 21 days undercover. The civil suits, filed under 42 U.S.C. Section 1983, alleged violations of Fourth Amendment rights, racial profiling, and fabrication of probable cause. The city's legal counsel had already signaled that settlement discussions would be preferred to discovery, which told Hollins everything he needed to know about how much documentation the city did not want made public. The settlements, when they came, months later, after motions and counter-motions and the grinding procedural machinery that characterized civil rights litigation, would total just under $800,000 across the 3 cases. The city would admit no wrongdoing. The settlement agreements would contain non-disclosure provisions, and the officers involved would face no individual consequences beyond the notation in their personnel files that most future employers would never see. Partial justice, the only kind the system reliably produced. Nolan did not attend the rally. He was, by that point, back at the FBI field office, writing the formal statement that would form the backbone of the DOJ's preliminary review. 214 pages. 21 days of documentation, plus 14 hours of personal experience, rendered in the precise, affectless prose that federal agents used for evidence. No adjectives, no opinions, no emotional coloring. Just facts. Timestamps, badge numbers, verbatim quotes. The architecture of accountability, built brick by careful brick. He finished the statement on a Tuesday evening, sent it to Okafor, closed his laptop, drove to East 48th Street. The closing had happened the previous week, delayed by 2 days because of the arrest, because the real estate attorney had understandably wanted to understand why her client had spent a night in a holding cell before finalizing a $500,000 property transaction. The paperwork was signed, the keys were in his pocket. The house was his. He parked in the driveway, got out, stood on the front porch, the same porch he'd assessed for structural damage 3 weeks earlier, the same porch visible in Felicia Greer's video, the same porch that would appear, in slightly different light and from slightly different angles, in the news coverage and the rally footage and the social media posts that had turned a sidewalk arrest into a national conversation. The porch was quiet now. The street was quiet. The live oak's canopy filtered the last light of a Savannah evening into something golden and temporary. Footsteps on the sidewalk. Felicia Greer, walking her dog. A gray pit mix named Roosevelt, who had the dignified, slightly arthritic gait of a senior citizen on his evening constitutional. She stopped when she saw him. The phone was in her pocket this time, not recording. Just a neighbor seeing another neighbor on his own porch. "Mr. Beckett," she smiled. "You actually bought the place." "I did." She looked at the house, at the porch, at the fence that still leaned at the northeast corner where the root had shifted the post, at the roof where shingles were still missing and gutters still sagged. "After everything that happened, you still want to live here?" He took a sip of the coffee he'd brought from the car. Black. No sugar. "Especially after everything." The answer was not defiance, not stubbornness, not the dramatic declaration of a man making a point about racial justice or civil rights, or the symbolic importance of occupying space that others had tried to deny him. It was simpler than that, quieter. He liked the porch, he liked the oak tree, he liked the neighborhood, or he would, given time and patience, and the slow accumulation of mornings that turned a house into a home. He was good at patience. It was perhaps the thing he was best at. Felicia nodded, tugged Roosevelt's leash gently. "Welcome to the neighborhood, Mr. Beckett. For real this time." She walked on. Roosevelt padded beside her, tail swaying with the unhurried rhythm of a dog who had nowhere to be and no reason to rush. Nolan sat on his porch, watched the street settle into evening. The lights came on in the houses around him. One by one, window by window, the neighborhood performing its nightly ritual of retreat, each family sealing itself inside its own small world. Margot Sinclair's house at 403 was dark. It had been dark since the day after the arrest, when the 911 recording was made public, and the phrase, "There is a man, black, standing in front of the Hemmings property," entered the local lexicon as shorthand for a kind of weaponized anxiety that everyone recognized but no one had a clean word for. Margot had not been charged with filing a false report. The 911 call technically reported a concern rather than a crime, and Georgia law required demonstrable intent to deceive for a false report prosecution. But the court of public opinion operated on different standards, and Margot Sinclair had been tried, convicted, and sentenced to social exile within 72 hours of the recording's release. Her HOA presidency was suspended pending review. Her book club had stopped meeting at her house. Her personal details, address, phone number, the name of the salon where she had her hair done bi-weekly, circulated online in the chaotic, uncontrolled way that personal information circulated in the age of viral outrage. And she'd responded by closing her curtains, silencing her phone, and retreating into the particular American solitude of a person who has been publicly identified as the villain in a story they still believe they were right about. Nolan did not feel satisfaction about this, did not feel vindication. Felt, if anything, a complicated weariness, the weariness of a man who understood that Margot Sinclair's 911 call was not an aberration, but a symptom, and that symptoms, however dramatic, did not disappear when you treated individual cases. They recurred, they adapted, they found new hosts, and new expressions, and new phone numbers to dial. The system that had trained Margot to fear a black man with a notebook was the same system that had trained Garland to arrest one, the same system that had taught Pratt to manage narratives rather than manage truth, the same system that had allowed Delaney to fabricate evidence on a restricted radio channel and Sheridan to authorize a 14-hour detention with a 12-second signature. One system, one investigation, one set of consequences that would take years to fully materialize and that would, even at their most thorough, leave the underlying architecture largely intact. That was the reality, not the dramatic, satisfying, conclusive reality of stories that ended with villains punished and heroes vindicated. The other reality, the one that people who worked inside institutions understood viscerally, the reality of incremental progress, of partial victories, of foundations laid for battles that other people, in other years, would have to fight. And if you've made it this far, you already know. This story isn't over. Not for Nolan, not for Savannah, not for any of us. Hit subscribe and tell me in the comments, what do you think Phase 2 will uncover? That night, long after Felicia and Roosevelt had completed their walk and the streetlights had replaced the oak tree's golden light with something colder and more clinical, Nolan sat in the kitchen of his new house with the secure laptop open on the counter. One new email from ASAC Okafor. Subject line, Operation Clean Sweep, Phase 2, Authorization. He opened it, read it. The email was short. Okafor wrote the way she spoke, with a precision that treated words as tools rather than decorations. Phase 2 was authorized. Expanded scope, internal communications audit, financial records review, personnel file analysis for all identified subjects, priority targets, Delaney's tip-off source, the missing notebook pages, and a new line of inquiry that Nolan hadn't anticipated, but that the DOJ's preliminary data analysis had flagged, a statistical anomaly in the department's overtime records that suggested a pattern of officers logging hours at locations that didn't correspond to their assigned patrol zones. Ghost shifts. Officers being paid to be places they weren't, or being paid to be places they were for reasons that had nothing to do with policing. The investigation was growing, spreading roots into soil that Nolan had only begun to map. Whatever the program was, the phrase he'd overheard at Sentient Bean, the reference whose meaning remained undecoded. It was connected to something larger than racial profiling, something that involved money, structure, the kind of coordination that didn't happen by accident. He closed the email, opened the new notebook, spiral-bound, college-ruled, nothing special, turned to the first page, where he'd written a single word that morning at the coffee shop. He added 2 more words beneath it. 3 words total in the small, precise handwriting that had filled 21 days of grids and would fill many more. Phase 2. Proceed. He closed the notebook, turned off the laptop, turned off the kitchen light. The house settled around him. New sounds, unfamiliar creaks, the particular voice of a structure learning to hold a person it hadn't held before. Outside, East 48th Street was silent. Ardsley Park was silent. Savannah was silent in the way that southern cities are silent after dark, not empty, but resting, conserving energy for whatever the morning would bring. Nolan climbed the stairs to the bedroom. The bed was made. He'd made it that morning, before leaving for the precinct, before the coffee shop, before any of it. Hospital corners. Blanket folded into a precise rectangle. Shoes parallel at the foot, toes pointing toward the door. He set his glasses on the nightstand. Lay down. Closed his eyes. Sleep came quickly. The sleep of a man who had finished one thing and was preparing for the next. The sleep of a man whose patience was not exhaustion, but strategy. The sleep of a man who understood that the work would continue tomorrow and the day after that, for as long as it took, for as long as the system required diagnosis, for as long as the gap between what institutions promised and what they delivered remained wide enough for people to fall through. He slept. And 2 blocks away, in the mailbox of 417 East 48th Street, the mailbox he hadn't checked yet, the mailbox that still bore the previous owner's name on a faded adhesive label, a plain white envelope sat waiting. No return address, no postage, hand-delivered. Inside, 3 photocopied pages, notebook pages, grid-ruled, small precise handwriting, pages 17, 18, and 19, the pages torn from his moleskin, reproduced on a standard office copier, the kind found in every precinct and office building in Savannah. And at the bottom of page 19, below Nolan's original notes, a single line of handwriting that was not his. Block letters, blue ballpoint. The handwriting of someone who had read his documentation, understood its implications, and decided, for reasons that might have been conscience, or self-preservation, or some combustible mixture of both, to ensure that the evidence survived. 7 words. They know you kept copies. Be careful. The envelope sat in the dark mailbox, patient, waiting. The way all evidence waits, for the hand that will find it, the mind that will understand it, and the slow, difficult, necessary work of turning documentation into accountability. Morning would come. Nolan would find the envelope, would read the 7 words, would understand that somewhere inside the institution he was investigating, someone was watching, someone who knew what the missing pages contained and who had ensured their survival. An ally, a traitor, a frightened participant, a conscience stirring inside a system designed to suppress exactly that, impossible to know which, from 7 words and 3 photocopied pages. But the pages existed. The evidence existed. The investigation existed. And the quiet man on East 48th Street, the man who had been handcuffed for standing on a sidewalk, held for 14 hours without charges, denied his rights by the very institution he'd been sent to investigate, that man existed too. In his new house, on his new street, in a city that was only beginning to understand what his presence meant. He would be there tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that, patient, quiet, documenting, the way he always had, the way he always would, until the work was done, or until the system changed enough that work like his was no longer necessary, whichever came first. The morning light would tell.
Thank you for taking the time to watch this video today. If you found the content helpful, please remember to like and subscribe so you won't miss our upcoming episodes. If you have any questions or suggestions, feel free to leave a comment below. We are always here to listen.